Chapter 765. The late autumn rain gradually grew heavier. Wu Zhu walked out of the alley in the rain, under the strange gazes of the passers-by, and came to a small fork in the road beside the Tianhe River. The wet rainwater flowed down his clothes and slowly dripped down the black cloth on his face. He stopped here and then raised his head slightly, looking at the distant imperial palace in the misty rain. Yesterday afternoon, Wu Zhu had also spent half a day looking at the royal palace. Although he came from the temple and had unconsciously followed Fan Xian to see the world of mortals, the royal palace was indeed the most worthwhile place to visit in the capital. It was the most magnificent building, but Wu Zhu had come here 2 days in a row. Presumably, some other opportunity had influenced his decision. Under the eaves on the side of the street, a few urchins in cotton-padded jackets were carrying square school bags. They rubbed their hands against the cold, their faces pale from the cold. Every day, these children went to the public schools set up by the court to study, and they all carried umbrellas with them. But when they reached the mouth of the alley, the rain suddenly grew heavier. "Look, it's that idiot from yesterday." One of the children thought that the rain was too boring. Although it seemed that they could delay class, who would want to bow their head under someone else's roof? At that moment, he discovered Wu Zhu standing woodenly in the rain like an idiot. He recognized him as the idiot who had allowed himself to be abused by him the day before, and was as happy as if he had discovered a new continent. There were no stones under the eaves, and the urchins rolled their eyes. Next to a coal stove, they found some bits of coal that had not completely burned out the night before. With shrill laughter and yelling, they began to throw them at Wu Zhu. For some reason, it seemed that when humans were very young, they were very good at bullying people weaker than themselves to prove their strength, and thus obtain some sort of spiritual satisfaction. This seemed to be a kind of innate nature. Otherwise, why would the children feel joy when they heard the bits of coal falling on Wu Zhu's body? Why would they feel joy when they saw Wu Zhu's body smashed and dirty? There were not many people hiding from the rain on the streets. In the eyes of these few Jingdo commoners, the blind man, standing in the rain in a daze, was clearly an idiot and a handicapped person. They couldn't help but feel some sympathy, but when they saw the stains on the blind man's body, they unconsciously felt some disgust. Therefore, other than a woman who looked like an auntie, who fiercely scolded those little brats, no one else did anything. They just watched indifferently as those disapproving children used their own methods to vent their violent desires that were inherent in all life. With a smack, a lump of coal soaked in water ruthlessly smashed into Wu Zhu's motionless and expressionless face. It made a crisp sound, as if he had been slapped in the face. That piece of coal knocked the black cloth off Wu Zhu's face a little. Wu Zhu's pale face also tilted a little, as if he did not quite understand what had happened. Then, he straightened the black cloth on his face and slowly turned around to look at the children under the eaves whose hands were not clean. The urchins were not afraid because they had smashed him all afternoon yesterday, and this blind idiot showed no signs of resistance. On the contrary, seeing that Wu Zhu had reacted today, they felt even more excited. The bits of coal that were smashed into the rain in the street suddenly became denser. Smack, smack, smack. Finally, someone found a stone. Mixed with the coal, they smashed it into Wu Zhu's head and face, leaving behind dirty marks and a few streaks of blood. Washed by the rain, they flowed on Wu Zhu's pale face like a flood after a dry season, carrying thousands of years of trash. On the face of the earth, they washed out frightening marks. Wu Zhu still did not dodge. Wu Zhu still did not dodge. It turned out that Wu Zhu could also be injured. Separated by the black cloth, he stared in a daze at the children who were laughing incessantly and waving their little hands. He did not understand why they wanted to attack him. He also did not understand why the innocent faces of these children could have such savage smiles. He also did not understand why the stones, regardless of whether they were sharp or round, smashed into his head or face. His heart felt somewhat strange. What kind of emotion was that? Sadness? Disappointment? Anger? Dissatisfaction? Or was it just emotion? Wu Zhu looked at the children and allowed them to smash him. Suddenly, in his muddled mind, there seemed to be something extra. The rain suddenly became heavy. It was as if someone had cut a large hole in the late autumn sky of the capital. Countless rivers, lakes, and seas poured down from that unfathomably deep hole, turning into a torrential downpour that filled the sky and scattered over the streets and on top of the homes. It was as if a large hole had suddenly opened in Wu Zhu's mind. Clear and unrestrained sunlight shone down, enveloping his entire body in a strange emotion. He had emotions. What did this prove? Was it the same as what the young man called Fan Xian said about curiosity? Wu Zhu began to think again. He thought silently in the boundless rain. The young man called Fan Xian had once said many things to him, but he did not understand. He could not understand. He could only remember it in his heart. What did the young man called Fan Xian do? It seemed that he went to the royal palace. It seemed to be for revenge. Why revenge? For whom? It seemed that someone had died. That was why the person called Fan Xian was dissatisfied and unhappy. It was a woman called Yi Qing Mei and an old cripple called Chen Pingping. These two unfamiliar names seemed to become clearer and more familiar in Wu Zhu's mind, along with the rain that filled the sky and the clear light that shone through the large hole. However, what gave him a headache was that he still could not remember who they were. Had he not been in the temple his entire life? Wu Zhu still couldn't remember anything, but he had something he shouldn't have had, and that was emotions. In fact, since yesterday afternoon, those emotions had already filled his heart, causing his eyes to only be separated by a black cloth as he quietly looked at the imperial palace. This emotion was called disgust. For some reason, Wu Zhu could not explain it. He loathed the tallest building in Jingdou. Perhaps it was because he instinctively loathed the people inside the building. When he left the snowy temple, the young man called Fan Xian coughed up blood and told him to follow his heart. But what was the heart? Was it the fresh and unfamiliar emotion he was feeling right now? Wu Zhu decided to go to the royal palace to have a look and find the true source of his emotions. He wanted to see if there was anyone inside he wanted to see, someone he was fated to see. Thus, he placed his hands steadily on the metal drill by his waist. At the same time, he lowered his head slightly and put on the bamboo hat on his back again. He blocked the rain from the sky and covered his eyes with the black cloth. However, the children were still happily throwing stones and coal debris. After a moment of silence, Wu Zhu let go of the iron drill in his hand and squatted down. His palm moved through the flowing sewage on the ground and grabbed a handful of coal debris that was not hard. He could not harm humans unless it was for the benefit of humanity as a whole. The biggest difference between Wu Zhu and the old man in the temple was that he did not understand what the benefit of humanity as a whole was and what it had to do with him. Perhaps those young humans were only playing a game. Wu Zhu thought so and reacted in this way. At least, he did not feel any disgust or anger toward these young humans who bullied and humiliated him. Since it was a game, he would play a game with them once. Perhaps they would stop bothering him like this. Wu Zhu directly threw the coal mixed with rainwater toward the children under the eaves by the side of the street. A wave of terrified cries, a wave of panicked footsteps, countless cries, and the sound of someone fainting in the rain fell to the ground. A mess of sounds followed Wu Zhu's actions. A handful of coal briquettes mixed with dirty water accurately split into 4 portions and accurately hit the bodies of the urchins. One of the urchins who laughed the loudest had his head smashed and blood oozed out. He fainted in the rain without making a sound. After a deathly silence, an angry roar suddenly exploded. An idiot killed someone. The previously cold and detached Jingdou commoners suddenly became outstanding citizens who were eager for justice. They reported to the officials and their parents. There were even some middle-aged men who took out wooden sticks and mops and prepared to beat the idiot to the ground. They were all neighbors. Naturally, they could not just watch as the children suffered so much. The mother of the child who had fainted on the ground threw herself on top of the child, crying loudly and cursing Wu Zhu with hatred. Wu Zhu watched all of this coldly. He still did not understand. If this was a game, why was the woman crying? If this was not a game, why did they not stop the children earlier? He knew that he would not be hurt. Did these humans also know that he was not normal? Did they not worry about his safety when the children beat him earlier? In the rain, the silent Wu Zhu vaguely learned a few things. He understood a little that human emotions had nothing to do with choice or reason. It turned out that it was divided by affection and disgust. In this world, Wu Zhu believed that the person closest to him should be that young man called Fan Xian. He hated the royal palace the most, so he no longer paid attention to these people who seemed to have gone mad. Very seriously, he smoothed out the wrinkles on the black cloth on his face again. Placing his hand on the metal drill at his waist, he stepped toward the royal palace in the distance. Someone tried to kill this idiot, blind, crazy person and then fainted on the ground. The wooden stick also broke in two. In the heavy rain, Wu Zhu, dressed in cotton clothes and wearing a straw hat, easily walked out of the angry crowd of Jingdo people, leaving behind only a ground of people crying out in pain. Wu Zhu did not kill anyone. It was not that he did not dare to, but it was a habit he had developed over hundreds of thousands of years. He did not kill when he did not want to, but when he wanted to, he would. When the bailiffs of the capital government arrived at the fork of the river, the madman who had beaten the people had long disappeared. Looking at the people crying out in pain in the rain, the leader of the bailiffs took a quick look and sucked in a breath of cold air. He wondered who this master was to be able to act so cleanly and efficiently. How could a master disdain to make life difficult for these defenseless people? The leader of the bailiffs felt a chill, not because of the people's injuries, but because of the blind man who had disappeared. If, as the people said, that person was an idiot, then, without question, this idiot must be the most powerful martial madman in history. Having such a martial madman running around in the capital, the leader of the bailiffs was afraid. He immediately had his subordinates notify the yamen of the capital government, and then nervously asked the person next to him, "Where did that madman go?" "I think he went in the direction of the square," the person replied with a trembling voice. He gritted his teeth and said, "That person has been watching the palace for 2 days. I'm afraid there's something wrong." The leader of the bailiffs did not need to ask again to know that this person wanted to kill the madman. If anything involved the palace, there was no way out. But hearing that the martial madman was heading straight in the direction of the palace, the leader of the bailiffs felt a bit more relaxed. After all, there were many masters in the palace, and the imperial guards were strict. Even the most powerful martial madman could only be beaten to the ground. Even if the legendary Sir Fan came back, could he break into the palace? The rain continued to fall. Wu Zhu did not know how urgently the people on the street behind him wanted him dead. He also did not know that the leader of the bailiffs had already sentenced him to death. He only wore a straw hat and held a metal drill. Step by step, he walked toward the square of the palace with unusual stability and straightforwardness. In Langia County in northern Xi, the new cloth shoes Fan Xian had bought for him had long been soaked in the water. With each step, it was like a drum sounded in Wu Zhu's mind, pounding against his heart and soul. Yi Qing Mei, Chun Pingping, Fan Xian, these names that seemed far away but were also close rang out endlessly in his mind. With each step, he faintly remembered something. Although it was not clear, it was particularly close. For example, this royal palace in the cold rain, this Jingdo filled with a familiar smell, and it was filled with glass he had made. It was so familiar. At the same time, as he approached the square of the imperial city, Wu Zhu's disgust for the imperial palace deepened. This majestic imperial city that stood in the storm was so unshakable, so strict and disgusting. Jingdo was an old place, and the royal palace was also an old place, Wu Zhu thought. Walking alone in the rain in an old place, he had to run into a road blocked by rain. The road was quiet and lonely, and he was too lazy to avoid in the rain. What blocked Wu Zhu's path was people, not the rain. It was a group of imperial soldiers in full armor and full of murderous intent. The rain fell on the gray armor of these elite soldiers of the Qing military, making pitter-patter sounds. It fell on their solemn faces, but it did not stir up the slightest change in their emotions. The expression on Wu Zhu's face did not change in the slightest. His body continued to lean forward, allowing the bamboo hat on his head to block out the pouring rain. His feet did not slow down, nor did he speed up. He only steadily walked at a speed he was accustomed to, toward the center of the plaza. Wu Zhu wanted to enter the royal palace to have a look, so he had to pass through the main gate of the royal palace and walk through the square in the rain. For him, this was unusually simple logic. He did not care at all whether or not someone would stop him. For the imperial soldiers responsible for the safety of the royal palace, his unusually simple logic appeared unusually cold and daring. The news of Fan Xian's return to the capital had already spread from the Yi Manor last night. Now all of the upper echelons of the Qing kingdom knew of this shocking news. The royal palace had been under martial law since last night. Everything that entered was checked very strictly. The defense had also been raised to an unprecedented level of tension. Even on the day the Jingdo garrison had escorted the old director of the Overwatch Council back to the capital, the security in the royal palace had not been as tight as it was today. Everyone knew why Fan Xian had returned to the capital. He would certainly try to enter the palace again to assassinate the emperor. The Qing court would not give this rebel a second chance. The imperial army's patrol work extended out by a third of the area. There was a heavy rain this morning. The wet and cold feeling made everyone raise their guard. They also felt waves of fear. They didn't know where Fan Xian was or when he would kill his way into the palace. The small disturbance at the fork in the Tiana Road had also fallen into the eyes of the imperial army. However, the soldiers responsible for the safety of the outer perimeter did not see the sudden incident of a martial madman as too important. However, when this blind martial madman, wearing a conical hat, suddenly displayed astonishing strength and began to silently walk toward the imperial palace, the imperial guards finally realized that something was amiss. When the cloth shoe on the blind man's right foot stepped onto the puddles of water on the stone slabs of the square, the imperial army gave their first warning. They began to gather their military power and prepare to capture him in one move. However, it was as if Wu Zhu did not hear the warning that was enough to chill the hearts of most people in the world. He continued to walk steadily and silently. Under the wary gaze of the imperial army on the palace walls and the cold and stern gaze of the imperial army soldiers in the square, he walked steadily step by step. After 3 warnings, the blind man in the heavy rain still acted as if he did not hear them and turned a blind eye to them. Step by step, he walked toward the center of the square, toward the front gate of the royal palace. Even at this moment, the soldiers of the imperial army still believed that this strange person was a lunatic and did not associate him with an assassin. In the eyes of the common people, no matter how powerful an assassin, even Sigu Jian of the past, would not choose such an open and honorable method of assassination. Surrounded by tens of thousands of imperial army soldiers, under the towering walls of the royal palace, no one would be able to break through the obstruction of so many people, kill their way into the royal palace, and point their sword at the emperor, unless there really was a god in this world. Thus, the imperial army thought this strange blind man was perhaps a madman with extremely bad luck. In such a tense situation, to suddenly charge into the forbidden area in front of the royal palace, what awaited him could only be death. Wu Zhu continued to walk as if he did not see the row of imperial army soldiers blocking him in front of him. At this time, the wind and rain that filled the sky were still wreaking havoc. The endless rain was like a huge wave on the East Sea, about to swallow up his lonely figure. In the end, it was unable to swallow him because he walked out of the rain. Kill. An imperial army officer narrowed his eyes slightly. He felt a bone-piercing chill coming from the body of the blind man not far away. The blind man had already walked into the forbidden area. Furthermore, a sense of danger made the officer give the order without any hesitation. With a swoosh, the imperial army soldiers blocking in front of Wu Zhu drew their swords in unison. In an instant, the light of the swords lit up the rainy sky in front of the royal palace. There was no loud swishing of swords. Wu Zhu only steadily pulled out the metal drill at his waist and then stabbed out. His speed did not appear fast in the ruthless wind and rain. Furthermore, the way he stabbed out with the drill was not particularly exquisite. However, each time the metal drill was thrust out, The tip of the drill would accurately pierce the throat of an Imperial Army soldier. Accurate, clean, and stable. This was the feeling Wu Zhu felt when he attacked. It was very simple, but when it reached the extreme, it became a certain realm. From the time the officer said the word kill to when Wu Zhu killed all the Imperial Army soldiers in front of him, only a few breaths had passed. In the sky full of rain, the ground behind Wu Zhu was littered with bodies. Fresh blood had just surged out from the throats of the bodies when it was washed away by the rain. In the process of killing, Wu Zhu's speed did not change at all. His 2 feet advancing in the rain remained steady as if he had not encountered any hindrance. He moved through the rain and killed as he went. This was not the ease of a peerless ace. It did not give the Imperial Army soldiers around the royal palace the feeling of a powerful warrior taking a leisurely stroll. They only felt cold, very cold. The blind man's attacks were steady to the point of incomparable coldness. The Imperial soldiers didn't even know how their colleagues had died to that metal drill. This was because the blind man in the bamboo hat didn't exude an aura that could pierce through the heavens and earth, and his attacks weren't particularly crafty or vicious. However, the metal drill seemed to be covered in a layer of heavenly coldness. In the rain, it easily calculated all the angles and possibilities. Then, it chose the most reasonable crack in space and passed it out. It seemed to be simple, yet it was actually capable of shaking the heavens and the earth, and it was sufficient to cause everyone who witnessed this scene to completely lose all confidence in going against him. The officer watched helplessly as his subordinates died at the hands of the blind man wearing the straw hat without even making a sound. He felt a chill throughout his body, colder than the autumn rain that fell incessantly around him. Wu Zhu walked in front of him. The officer suddenly felt that the other party's clothes, which had been soaked by the rain and had turned dark, were not ordinary clothes. The metal drill in the other party's hand was also not an ordinary weapon. The other party was not a person, but a monster that condensed all the mysteries between heaven and earth and breathed in all the coldness between heaven and earth. The officer's entire body trembled. He bravely pulled out his knife. Then he saw the metal drill pierce into his chin. It was then pulled back like a flash of lightning. Too fast. Why did it seem so slow earlier? Why couldn't he dodge it no matter what? The officer fell heavily into the rain with these questions in his mind. His eyes, filled with fear, were gradually drowned by the water. Then he saw a pair of soaked cloth shoes walk past his head. At this moment, the feet wearing the cloth shoes were still as steady as ever. The rain continued to fall, and the Imperial soldiers continued to die. The fear of the unknown brought about by the god of killing in the bamboo had made the Imperial soldiers responsible for the safety of the royal palace extremely angry and courageous. Wave after wave, they charged forward to kill. However, these Imperial Army soldiers were unable to stop Wu Zhu's steady footsteps in the slightest. Wu Zhu lowered his head, turned around, and bent his knees. With a calmness and calculation that completely exceeded the imagination of mortals, he calmly moved aside all the weapons that could harm his body. Then he thrust out the metal drill and tore apart the curtain of autumn rain in front of him. He tore apart the layers of encirclement in front of him. He only wanted to enter the royal palace to take a look. Because of this, people continuously fell by his side. Blood continuously dyed the curtain of rain red. People continuously died and fell into the rain. There were incessant cries of alarm, miserable screams, and muffled grunts. He was like an emissary of heaven who had fallen into the dust for some unknown reason. Using the calmest and most terrifying method, he was harvesting the guards by the emperor's side and harvesting the lives of the common and lowly. The people in front of Wu Zhu grew fewer and fewer, but the corpses on the ground grew more and more. Suddenly, Wu Zhu stopped in the middle of the square in front of the royal palace. There was no longer a single person standing by his side. Around him, hundreds of Imperial Army soldiers lay in pools of blood. No matter how violent the autumn rain was, it could not wash away the blood in an instant. He slowly raised his head and looked above the royal palace. The Imperial Army on the palace walls had long drawn their bows and knocked their arrows. The densely packed arrows were already aimed at Wu Zhu in front of the palace gates. At any moment, tens of thousands of arrows could be fired. Wu Zhu stood in the blood and raised his head. Separated by the black cloth, he looked at the familiar yet strange royal palace and the terrifying arrows. His face that was exposed outside the cloth was still calm. There was no fear at all. He only slowly raised his right arm and extended the metal drill in his hand into the torrential rain, allowing the rain to wash away the bloodstains on it. The rain struck the metal drill with a pitter-patter. The Imperial army, who had been struck out of their wits by the metal drill, had been ordered back into the palace gates. At this moment, the Vermilion palace gates were tightly shut. Other than the bloody corpses lying on the ground, there was only the stormy sea of wind and rain and the blind man wearing the straw hat standing alone. Countless people on the royal palace saw this scene and felt a chill from the depths of their hearts. Who exactly was this unimaginably powerful blind man? The pale-faced commander of the Imperial army, Gong Dian, stood on the palace walls and watched the blind man, standing alone in the rain. His body trembled slightly. He thought of the woman and her young servant many years ago. An unprecedented fear welled up in the depths of his heart. He knew who the other party was. At the first moment, he had already notified the emperor in the palace. However, he had no idea whether or not his tens of thousands of Imperial army soldiers could stop the other party. Wu Zhu had come. Wu Zhu had finally come. He had come to avenge the mistress. These words that made his heart tremble echoed endlessly in Gong Dian's heart. Wu Zhu, who stood alone in the wind and rain and used a metal drill to challenge the entire powerful Qin court, did not have these thoughts. He only suddenly said to himself, "The one living inside seems to be Xiao Lizi." The wind and rain filled the sky, and this person stood alone. Although there were millions of people, he would go forward. It's the last few days. My feelings are very complicated. Brothers and sisters, please give more recommendation votes and flower votes. Everyone together, let's make the ending of the story of Qing Yu a little more beautiful, a little more beautiful. Chapter 766. There should be 3 more chapters. There are 3 more chapters. Then, there's a final chapter and a postscript. Anger, resentment, sorrow. Let's all vote for the recommendation. Only yesterday did I discover that flower tickets also cost money. Yes, let's work hard together and make a pretty cattail. Fire the arrows. The pale-faced commander of the Imperial army gave the order in a trembling voice as rainwater dripped from Gong Dian's messy beard. Countless arrows left the taut bowstrings. Abruptly, their speed rose to a peak. They tore through the rain in the air and shot toward Wu Zhu, who stood alone in the middle of the square. The densely packed arrows seemed like they were going to cover the sky and the sun. However, the torrential rain had stolen this effect first. Thus, it was as if the countless arrows that flew out were dissatisfied. They tore apart all of the raindrops in the air between heaven and earth, making the sky above the square become a large curtain of water like a divine realm. Contrasted with this terrifying power were the sinister whistling of the arrows as they pierced through the air. These sounds represented the Qin kingdom's powerful military power and an irresistible killing intent. No one could survive such a dense arrow attack, not even Fan Xian. Even Yi Luyuan on Dong Mountain had only faced a few hundred arrows. Furthermore, in that kind of terrain, a great grandmaster's swift movements had always been their greatest protection. How to kill a great grandmaster? Fan Xian had once thought deeply about this problem. It had to be done on the plains. Tens of thousands of arrows fired in unison, and then heavily armored riders charged in succession. Only then could they not give a great grandmaster a chance to escape. Standing alone in the rain, Wu Zhu was very powerful. At least, those who knew his name never thought he was weaker than a great grandmaster. It was clear that the Imperial army's retreat and release of arrows matched Fan Xian's plan back then. The square was wide. Although it was raining, there was nothing that could block one's line of sight. How could Wu Zhu dodge? There were people who could fight one against 10,000. However, when the arrows were fired in unison, It was like the power of 10,000 people coming together. How could they be blocked? Faced with arrows that were even denser than the torrential rain, could Wu Zhu still stand in the center of the plaza with incomparable strength? Wu Zhu's movements were not as fast as Yi Liuyun's. Wu Zhu's attacks were not as wild and ruthless as Sigu Jian's. Wu Zhu was unable to use the power of the rain to escape like Ku He. He only raised his head coldly. Separated by the layer of wet black cloth, he looked at the black rain of arrows coming at him. The strong wind pressed against his face and enveloped an area of dozens of feet around him. The tip of the arrow pierced through the raindrops and arrived in front of him. In the present world, the person with the best qigong should be Fan Xian. With the help of the magic book Ku he had left behind, he could leap over 30 meters on the snowy ground. However, even he, faced with this sky full of arrows, had no way to suddenly move like lightning and leap out of the range of the rain of arrows. Thus, Wu Zhu's body did not move. He did not try to avoid this rain of arrows, which had clearly been accumulating power for a long time, because no one could avoid it. He only pulled back the metal rod in the rain and held it horizontally in front of his chest. Like a door, it suddenly closed, locking his figure behind the rain and fog. Thud, thud, thud. The terrifying sound of countless arrows piercing their targets seemed to ring out at the same time. Some of the powerful arrows pierced into the stone tiles under Wu Zhu's feet and bounced up violently. In the air, they could not withstand the great force of the arrows and snapped with a crisp crack. Some of the arrows shot directly into the narrow gaps between the stone tiles. The feathers of the arrows buzzed. In an instant, countless arrows enveloped Wu Zhu's slightly thin body. After countless heart-palpitating sounds, the entire royal palace was silent. Everyone's pupils gradually constricted in fear as they looked at the scene in front of them in disbelief. The arrows were like weeds that had been brushed aside by the spring rain. They were densely inserted into the ground and splashed into the air in the center of the square in front of the royal palace. In the center of the densest rain of arrows, Wu Zhu continued to stand silently. At some point, the bamboo hat that he had always worn was now in his hands. Countless arrows pierced through it. It looked like a black ball of fur, exuding a cold light. His right hand still held the metal drill steadily. Below his right hand were countless arrows that had been broken by him. The rain-soaked square was filled with arrows. Wu Zhu stood among the broken arrows. Other than where his feet were standing, there was a ground full of broken, killing intent. It was as if he was the only person left standing on the clean ground in the world. The rain suddenly lessened. It was as if the heavens were beginning to faintly fear this blind man who still stood stubbornly under the tens of thousands of arrows and wanted to see this scene more clearly. Thus, a crack suddenly appeared in the thick rain clouds above the royal palace. The sunlight shone down through the crack and shone on Wu Zhu's body, faintly illuminating this blind man in plain clothes with a clear light. In the light rain, the autumn wind brushed past. Wu Zhu's soaked clothes gently fluttered. With a rustling sound, the bamboo hat in his left hand, which had withstood countless arrows, finally died of old age. In his hand, it scattered in all directions like a fragile lantern. No one knew what had happened. The imperial army had no idea how such a miraculous scene had appeared in the world. The moment the tens of thousands of arrows neared his body, Wu Zhu had actually moved. However, he had moved too quickly. The metal drill in his hand and the straw hat, which was spinning at high speed, all became afterimages in the rain. No one could see them at all. Wu Zhu's feet were like two stakes standing deep in the ground. The metal drill in his right hand seemed to have a life of its own. It completely calculated the trajectory of each arrow. Furthermore, with the powerful execution ability of Wu Zhu's limbs, he inconceivably cut down each arrow that truly pierced toward his body. Earlier, each time the metal drill slashed horizontally, it was forcefully limited by Wu Zhu to within the range of his body. It did not exceed an inch. He allowed the whistling arrows to brush past his clothes, his earlobes, and his thighs. He did not even glance at these arrows. The front of his silk-cloth shoes was full of arrows. Wu Zhu did not block them even once. This kind of absolute calculation ability and the confidence that came with it, as well as the valiant will it demonstrated, was not something that could be found in the mortal world. If it was any other great grandmaster, it would probably be impossible for them to be as calm as Wu Zhu earlier. In this world, other than Wu Zhu, no one could calculate so many things in such a short amount of time, and, in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, be able to make the most appropriate response. The tens of thousands of arrows were fired at once. They had to cover all of the areas where Wu Zhu could possibly dodge. Thus, the arrows that actually shot toward Wu Zhu's body were not that many. However, in this world, other than Wu Zhu, who could still make such a calm judgment in such a dangerous moment? Not many was only for Wu Zhu. Even so, the metal drill in his hand could not instantly cut down all of the concentrated arrows flying toward him. Thus, his left hand also moved. He directly took off the straw hat he wore on his head and began to spin it quickly in the rain. It swirled up countless arcs of rain and shook away countless arrows. The straw hat shattered like a lantern. With a crash, it fell to the wet ground and sent up countless broken arrows. With some difficulty, Wu Zhu straightened the 5 fingers on his left hand and looked at the arrows that had pierced through his arm. A very real emotion suddenly appeared on his originally expressionless face. It hurts a bit, Wu Zhu thought to himself. He then pulled out the arrows that had pierced deep into his bone and even out of his left forearm. The sound of the arrows rubbing against the flesh of his forearm seemed to cover up the gradually fading sound of the rain. The top and bottom of the royal palace was silent. Clear light shone down through the crack in the sky above Jingdou and shone on Wu Zhu's thin body. Slowly, and as if he didn't feel anything, he pulled the arrow out of his body. He then wiped away the liquid flowing from his wound and raised his foot again. When the step landed, the sound of arrows shattering filled the air. Wu Zhu was stepping on the pile of arrows in front of him as he walked toward the royal palace. The morale of the imperial army dropped to its lowest point, even lower than it had been a year ago when that startling sound had been heard. Although the fear of the unknown was terrifying, it was not as terrifying as seeing a monster with their own eyes. They didn't know who the warrior standing tall in the rain of arrows below the royal palace was. Unconsciously, they thought that the other party was not human. He was probably some kind of monster. Or an immortal? Given the strict discipline of the Qing army, even if they were faced with a great grandmaster who was praised by tens of thousands of people, perhaps they would not pause at all. Instead, they would use a torrential rain of arrows to kill the enemies of the Qing kingdom. However, today they truly felt fear. That was because that expert had not only displayed his unparalleled power, but more importantly, they were shocked by the indifference displayed by that expert. When Wu Zhu stepped on the densely packed pile of arrows that were like long grass in spring and was about to reach the palace gates, the second wave of arrows still did not fall. The pale-faced Gong Dian watched in a daze as the blind man came closer and closer. He suddenly felt a bitterness in his mouth. Sir Wu was already too close to the royal palace. Even if he attacked with arrows again, the effect would probably not be as good as before. Was the mission the emperor had given him truly impossible to complete? In this life, the Qing emperor only feared 2 things. One was the black chest, and the other was Lao Wu, who was walking steadily toward him. In the 20 years after the Taiping courtyard murder case, the emperor had wanted to eliminate Wu Zhu from this world more than once. However, in the end, he had still failed. In order to deal with Wu Zhu's revenge, the emperor had his own plans. Fan Xian had returned from the temple, so Wu Zhu had followed him back. The Qing emperor had never hoped for heaven to give him a pleasant surprise. He had actually not prepared much for Wu Zhu because there were not many ways in the world that could keep Wu Zhu in check. Furthermore, the Qing kingdom only had a gradually aging, tired, and injured emperor. Great Master Yi Luyuan had long floated far away. In the Qing emperor's view, the only way to eliminate Wu Zhu was this wall of the royal palace, the obstruction of countless imperial soldiers, and the fire that filled the sky. A few years ago, in the wasteland behind the Qing temple, the Qing emperor had personally seen the emissary of the temple gradually melt into a strange object in the fire. He had also heard the crackling sounds with his own ears. Gong Dian was the person specifically carrying out the Qing emperor's plan to eliminate Wu Zhu. For this, the imperial army had prepared fire arrows and corresponding facilities. However, heaven seemed to have truly abandoned the man it had chosen in the world in the autumn of the 12th year of the Qing calendar. When Wu Zhu arrived outside the royal palace with a strange and heavy mood, a storm that was rarely seen in a century in Jingdou suddenly fell from the sky. The pouring rain dealt a heavy blow to Gong Dian's preparations. It was as if he wanted to use this to wash away the past of the Qing court and send off a powerful ruler. Gong Dian took a deep breath and looked at Wu Zhu, who was coming closer and closer. He stopped releasing arrows and ordered in a raspy voice, "Prepare the oil." If he wanted to envelop Wu Zhu below the palace walls in a sea of fire, the explosive poison plan he had set up for the Overwatch Council during the Jingdou Rebellion 4 years ago was, without question, the most powerful. 4 years ago, Fan Xian had already hidden a large amount of gunpowder in the Overwatch Council stockpile under the little building. Most importantly, this rain that filled the sky, this damned rain. Thus, Gong Jian could only hope that the oil would be able to kill Sir Wu below the palace walls. The oil splashed down, but it could not splash onto Wu Zhu's body. Wu Zhu walked slowly and steadily, but he was like an antelope flying on a precipice as he arrived in front of the palace doors. The rain gradually lessened. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls finally lit a dozen fire arrows and shot them all down. The moment the flames touched the oil mixed with the water below the palace walls, they immediately began to burn fiercely. The flames were like a torrential rain rising from the ground, a rain of fire. Abruptly, a giant tongue of flame shot out, wanting to swallow Wu Zhu's lonely figure. Wu Zhu flew up. More accurately, he walked. It completely exceeded all human imaginations. The metal drill in his hand pierced into a crack about 6 feet above the royal palace. His body was like an arrow shot from a bowstring. It sped up rapidly and turned into a cold shadow. On the smooth and straight palace walls, his feet crossed endlessly as he ran toward the palace walls. No one could describe this scene. Wu Zhu was on the road, on the palace walls, running toward the rainy sky. When Wu Zhu's feet, wearing cloth shoes, landed firmly on the palace walls, Gong Dian knew that the situation was lost. In this world, other than the emperor, there was no one else who could stop Wu Zhu from entering the palace. Under the autumn rain, a thunderous sound of horse hooves suddenly came from a corner of the square. There were not many riders, but they were particularly stern. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, currently the foremost person in the Qing military, Commander Yi Zhong, had finally rushed over from the Bureau of Military Affairs. Yi Zhong's expression was shocked and ashen. The rain made his grizzled hair stick to his slightly black face. He looked unusually wretched. He looked at the lonely, blind figure on the palace walls from a distance. He jumped off his horse and sprinted wildly toward the palace walls in the rain. He almost tripped and fell. In a stern voice, he yelled, "Sir Wu, don't be rash. I know the temple has been abandoned, but I thought that since Lao Wu is a person of the temple would have a way to keep him there. Who knew that he would actually be able to return to the world? Why? Why did the wicked heavens have to rain so heavily today? Why is this so? I have the world in my heart and control tens of thousands of li of rivers and mountains in my hands. Unexpectedly, I have been forced in front of me by a man. Who can tell me why? How unfair the heavens are. If I was given a few more days, no, if I had not been injured by that chest that day, why would I fear Lao Wu coming? But even if Lao Wu came, so what? The emperor, who occasionally heard urgent reports from outside the palace, but still maintained a calm expression, suddenly had a cold smile rise to the corners of his lips. Slowly rising from the throne, he steadily raised his hands and had eunuch Yao at his side carefully check for wrinkles on his dragon robe. There were many kinds of dragon robes. The one the Qing Emperor was wearing was very close to his body. Presumably, it would not affect his attack later. However, why did the wrinkles at the corners of the Emperor's eyes appear so tired, so faint and sorrowful? Standing in the quiet and empty Taiji Palace, the Qing Emperor put his hands behind his back and was silent for a long time. His hair had been neatly combed and carelessly tied with a light yellow ribbon at the back of his head. He appeared particularly elegant. After a long time, he slowly opened his eyes. There was no longer the faint self-mockery in them when he questioned himself earlier. There was only calmness and powerful confidence. The Emperor's calm and cold gaze followed the open doors of Taiji Palace, passed through the square in front of the palace, and continued toward the main gates of the royal palace, where the sounds of killing were gradually rising. He knew that Lao Wu would come from there in a moment. He knew Lao Wu's personality. In his life, he would only take the most direct path. "Have you found Fan Xian?" His eyelids were slightly lowered as he gently turned a jade ring between his fingers. He asked casually. "Not yet." Eunuch Yao reported respectfully to the side. "The young lady of the Fan family disappeared last night." The Emperor closed his eyes and thought deeply for a moment. He then said, "It looks like I have still underestimated many people, such as Ruo." Eunuch Yao didn't dare to continue. He only felt that it was unusually strange. After the palace learned of the accurate news that Fan Xian had entered the capital, the Emperor had invited the young lady of the Fan family into the palace at the first opportunity. It was clear that the Emperor had his hands on Fan Xian's lifeline. However, the young lady of the Fan family had suddenly disappeared from the palace. If the young lady of the Fan family was a hidden ace, why had she been invited into the palace by the internal court and not escaped outside the palace? The tens of thousands of imperial soldiers outside the royal palace were still using their flesh and blood to stubbornly stop Wu Zhu from entering. The path was covered in blood, but not a single imperial soldier took a step back. Even when Sigu Jian used a wooden stick to kill ants under the tree, he still needed time. Furthermore, he was killing people now. Wu Zhu continued to kill calmly. However, the people in front of him never decreased. No one knew how much longer he would have to kill. There's still an hour left. The Emperor always seemed to be able to accurately grasp the development of everything in the world. He slowly walked out of Taiji Palace and stood in the long corridor. Looking at the increasingly sparse rain outside, he seemed to be deep in thought. The eunuchs and serving girls in the royal palace retreated far away with nervous expressions. There was only Eunuch Yao by the Emperor's side. He appeared very lonely. The Emperor's brows suddenly furrowed, and he gently coughed a few times. He accepted a pure white silk handkerchief from Eunuch Yao's hand and wiped the corner of his mouth. Coldly, he said, "If Nji still doesn't act, this matter will be interesting." The atmosphere in the royal palace was unusually tense and serious. There was not a trace of liveliness or liveliness. It was rather boring. Fan Xian was among the eunuchs at the end of Taiji Palace's long corridor. He watched the middle-aged man in the distance, or perhaps it should be said, old man, with unusually heavy and complicated emotions. Just after midnight, Fan Xian had come alone to the royal palace under the cover of the pitch-black night. This time, he did not try to do what he had done that year after the poetry conference in front of the palace and climb into the palace like a gecko. In Jingdo, because of the raging war in the north, and more so because of his return, the defenses had been raised to a terrifying level. It was already an impossible task to climb over the wall and enter. Thus, Fan Xian used the chess piece he had buried the deepest in this world. Other than him, only Wang Qinian knew about this chess piece. Deng Ziyu only had a faint understanding of it. It was Hong Zhu. Presently, Hong Zhu had returned to the royal study and was once again favored. With the secret guidance and help of this popular figure in the palace, Fan Xian appeared relaxed. But in reality, it was extremely dangerous to sneak into the royal palace through the direction of the laundry workshop. Fan Xian had not thought about what the consequences would be if Hong Zhu sold him out. He had already come this far in his second life. Whilst did he not dare to lose? After sneaking into the royal palace, Fan Xian learned of the news that his sister had once again been received into the royal palace. He immediately understood the emperor's thoughts. It looked like at this moment of life and death, the man sitting on the throne had finally torn off all pretense and was prepared to directly use Ruruo's life to threaten him. This was different from when Ruruo had been a hostage. At that time, the emperor had enough confidence in him, so he could still maintain his face as a saint. Fan Xian was also not worried that he would actually use his sister's life to threaten him. Now, the emperor was already old. His lingering injuries had not healed at all. He probably also smelled the glimmer of death. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and carefully lowered his head. Behind the serving girls, he gazed at the emperor in front of Taiji Palace through the gaps in their clothes. For a moment, his emotions were complicated. He also knew of the strange movements in the royal palace and guessed Uncle Wu Zhu's arrival. However, he could not understand. Had Uncle Wu Zhu truly woken up? No matter what, Fan Xian knew the strength of these powerful warriors and the powerful battle power of the Qing army. Even if Wu Zhu valiantly broke through the imperial army's defenses, he would still be injured when he came to Taiji Palace. Faced with the calm and unruffled emperor, what were Uncle Wu Zhu's chances of victory? Chapter 767. On the third day from the end, it was raining in Jingdou of the Qing kingdom. It was snowing in Nanjing. Light snow drifted gracefully and slowly through the air, filling the air with the coldness between heaven and earth. However, it still dropped the temperature to a level that humans detested. On the majestic city walls of Nanjing, the general of the Nanjing military department, Shang Shanpa, who was responsible for northern Qi's southern defense line, looked at the plains to the southwest with an indifferent expression. There was no snow on the plains. One could still see the hibernating black, fertile soil. His gaze pierced through the layers of wind and snow and landed on the solemn Qing military camp that had lasted for decades. The flags there fluttered in the wind and snow. The endless blackness stopped silently in the wind and snow. It was like a temporarily resting beast that could leap toward Nanjing at any moment. The Qing kingdom's Yanjing camp and northern camp had attacked with all their might. During this period of time, they had successively broken through 3 defense lines laid down by the northern Qi army. Like a prairie fire, they headed straight north. Along the way, they had killed countless northern Qi soldiers. They were now 20 li in front of the Nanjing defense line and were resting and reorganizing. It looked like the bloodiest and cruelest siege battle between 2 large countries was about to erupt at the foot of Nanjing. Shang Shampa couldn't resist, narrowing his eyes. His palm gently stroked the scabbard at his side. He looked at his subordinates, moving quickly like ants around him, preparing to defend the city in the icy weather. He sensed the tense and panicked atmosphere that filled the city and couldn't help but sigh. More than 100,000 Qing Iron Riders were already pressing in. How long could the most important city in the south of the Qi kingdom under him hold out? Shang Shampa shook his head and sent out a number of military orders to his subordinate officers. He then turned and descended the city walls to the temporary frontline tent that had been set up below the city walls. This tent was remote and quiet. It was personally guarded by his trusted soldiers outside. He did not have to worry about anyone getting close. Once he entered the tent, Shang Shampa looked at the man wearing commoner's clothing but was still powerful without anger. Very straightforwardly, he knelt down on one knee and said in a low voice, "Father, it looks like Wang Jikuan has lost his courage after the ambush a few days ago. He probably won't attack the city within 3 days." Everyone in the world thought that the pillar of the northern Qi military, Commander Shang Shanhu, who the Qing kingdom feared the most, should still be in the city of the Song kingdom between the waist of the Qing army. Who would have thought that just as the battle in Nanjing was about to break out, this valiant general would come to Nanjing alone without anyone noticing? Shang Shanhu's black silkworm eyebrows twitched slightly. A moment later, he said in a low voice, "Although Wang Jikuan's marching is a bit conservative, he is not a coward. Otherwise, why would the Qing emperor let him lead the Yanjing army for a dozen years?" The harassment these days looks like my army has taken advantage. In reality, he is like a turtle. He has not been lured out of any troops at all. Shang Shanpa listened to his father's buzzing voice echoing through the tent. A glimmer of admiration appeared in his eyes as he looked at his father. His father had secretly returned to Nanjing for some time. He had to prepare to welcome the great battle that was about to arrive. If his father had not secretly moved troops like a god and used the 3 lines of defense to cut through, it would have been impossible for the Qing Iron Riders to take so long to reach Nanjing. Wang Jikuan is truly shameless to the extreme. They clearly have the advantage in military power and are at their peak. Yet, they put on a defensive posture on the plains. Thinking of this, Shang Shampa couldn't help but curse out loud. They don't seek to be meritorious, but to not make mistakes. This is where Wang Jikuan's power lies. The Qing Kingdom. Shang Shanhu suddenly pulled back his gaze from the map and looked outside the tent. He sighed and said, "They have many soldiers and many generals. I can't take advantage of them." A glimmer of exhaustion suddenly appeared on the face of this famous northern Qi general. He had returned to Nanjing from the Song Kingdom because he was truly worried about the defenses here. Once the Qing Iron Riders actually broke through the Nanjing defense line, the center of the northern Qi court would directly face the flames of war from the south. The court would have to fall into chaos. Shang Shanhu had used a plan to split himself. The Qing Iron Riders still thought he was still in the Song Kingdom's capital and were probably extremely worried. However, he was secretly in Nanjing presiding over this line of defense. There was only one Shang Shanhu. Using this method, he was able to display more effect than just one Shang Shanhu. Faced with the Qing Kingdom's strict military discipline, excellent military equipment, and unusually valiant soldiers of over 100,000, no matter how skilled Shang Shanhu was at using troops, it was impossible for him to feel relaxed, particularly since this was not a field battle. It was a head-on collision between 2 large countries on the Nanjing defense line. In the end, it was still a battle of national strength and vigor. Shang Shanhu was not afraid of Wang Jikuan. He understood his counterpart in the south too well, so he was not afraid. These years, he had presided over the northern Qi military in the south. He had always kept his gaze focused on the royal palace in the distant Jingdao. He had always thought he understood the Qing emperor's military thinking. If the Qing kingdom truly wanted to carry out a northern expedition, then, according to theory, they would have to gather all the power of the entire country to attack the north. They would have to gather at least 3 roads of troops and forcefully push forward with an unstoppable force. However, there were only 2 roads of border troops outside Nanjing. The Qing emperor's boldness did not seem to be as powerful as he had imagined. Shang Shanhu narrowed his eyes slightly. His heart was heavy with worry. He thought to himself, what exactly is the ruler of the south thinking? Is there some trick that I haven't seen through? Would he still be able to defend this country? As a general, the most important thing was confidence. In front of the Qing kingdom's powerful military, Shang Shanhu did not have the confidence to fight and win. He believed that he could stop the Qing kingdom's northern expedition for a period of time. But for how long? A kind of exhaustion took hold of Shang Shanhu's heart. He suddenly thought of the secret edict the emperor had sent a few days ago. He had heard that Fan Xian of the Qing kingdom had already returned from the temple and should be in Jingdou by now. Was the fate of the Qi kingdom going to be entrusted to the Qing emperor's illegitimate child? Would Fan Xian kill the Qing emperor? Could it kill the Qing emperor? While Shang Shanhu was watching the Qing army camp dozens of li away from inside Nanjing, the Qing kingdom's military camp had already been set up. In the wind and snow, Commander Wang Jikuan was also using a cold gaze to look at the large city in the distance. As long as they broke through that city, the Qing army's most powerful riders would be able to kill their way into the heart of northern Qi. At that time, they would sweep away everything. Although they would still have to face the 2 lines of defense in front of Shangjing, presumably it would be much easier to fight than it was now. While they were attacking Nanjing, they had to defend against Shang Shanhu in the city of the Song Kingdom behind them. Although the Qing army's offensive was steady, It lacked the heroic aura of when they were expanding the borders. "When will Shi Fei arrive?" Wang Jiquan asked. A deputy general beside him replied without hesitation. "The general should arrive in 4 days." Wang Jiquan nodded his head with some relief. At the beginning of the northern expedition, the emperor had already drawn up all of the plans. Although, like Shang Shanhu in the distant Nanjing, Wang Jiquan sometimes felt that the emperor's boldness this time was not as great as it was in the past. His confidence in the emperor had never weakened. The emperor wanted to send Shi Fei to take over control of the wild army in the northern camp. This did not make Wang Jiquan feel any negative feelings. He did not mind others stealing his credit. He also did not think that the emperor did not trust him because Shi Fei had been his deputy general in the past. Furthermore, the northern expedition was a war to unify the world. No general dared to hope that they could accomplish such a great feat with their own strength. Wang Jiquan occasionally thought that at least he was better than Commander Yi. Commander Yi's current status was too noble. He could only give orders from the Bureau of Military Affairs in Jingdou and was unable to personally lead troops like him. How many years had he prepared? Wang Jiquan stood at the entrance of the tent and allowed the snowflakes to fall on his armor. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the distant city of Nanjing. Thinking that his feet were actually already standing on northern Qi territory, a boundless heroic feeling suddenly rose in his heart. He had guarded Yanjing for the emperor for over a dozen years just for this day. The majestic picture was in front of his eyes. How could there be any regret in life? Suddenly, a glimmer of coldness flashed through Wang Jiquan's eyes. His body trembled slightly. Although it was freezing cold, there were no problems with the Qing army's logistics and aura. However, there was always a strong sense of unease in his heart. Sir Fan Jr. had returned to Jingdou. Would the emperor be well? The northern Qi royal palace was built against the mountain. There was a mountain stream on the mountain. The stream flowed along the mountain path until it formed a clear pool at the very bottom. Beside the pool were stones. The clear water in the pool flowed out of the palace through a purposely open gap. The northern Qi emperor wore a large cloak with a dragon robe underneath. His eyebrows were raised slightly like swords, and his lips were tightly pressed together. Just like this, he sat by the gap in the pool and was silent for a long time without saying a word. Haidang stood by his side with her back to him. Her gaze followed the clear water flowing out of the pool until it reached outside the beautiful royal palace and the river that slowly flowed through Shangjing in winter. Before the Dong Mountain incident, Master Ku he had talked with the Empress Dowager in this pool and decided on some things before floating away. In the end, he returned dispiritedly and died of old age. He had lost to the Qing emperor. Presently, the northern Qi court was once again facing the threat of the powerful ruler in the south. However, this time, the threat was more real and direct. Countless Qing iron riders had already stepped onto the road to invade the north. No one knew when they would destroy this ancient capital and set this beautiful black royal palace on fire. I cannot put all my hopes on him. The northern Qi emperor's sword-like brows were slightly flat. His expression was slightly light. Slowly, he said, "Although I believe there is an irreconcilable hatred between him and the Qing emperor is, after all, his father. As for Fan Xian's fickle and naive emotions, I probably understand them better than many people. Most importantly, according to my aunt disciple, that blind great master has already become an idiot." The northern Qi emperor lowered his head and looked at his slightly distorted face in the water. Suddenly, he felt that the coldness between heaven and earth had become an unprecedented burden, pressing down on him until he almost couldn't breathe. With slight disappointment, he said, "If that is truly the case, then who can kill that ruler in the Qing royal palace? Everyone knows of the Qing people's ambitions. I have prepared for this for many years. Only when the battle began did I realize that I had still underestimated the valiance of the Qing army." The northern Qi emperor raised his face. A glimmer of determination flashed through his eyes. "It is only 2 roadside armies, yet they can kill their way to Nanjing. If the Qing emperor truly brought the entire country to attack, Even Shang Shanhu would not be able to hold out for long. If General Shang Shanhu cannot hold out, what does your majesty plan to do? Haiding slowly turned around and asked calmly. Use the power of the entire country to fight, the Northern Qi Emperor replied with a slight smile. He didn't think at all. In the end, this world is my world. Even if jade is to shatter, it will shatter my hands. I have never had any thoughts of admitting defeat. Haiding didn't say anything else. She only looked calmly out of the palace and toward the south with her hands gently pressed together. In the territory controlled by Dongyi, at the border between the Song Kingdom and the Liang Kingdom, the land was blown by the sea breeze. It had warmer and more humid weather than Shangjing and Jingdou. The trees in the mountains still retained a rare green color. Who would have known that after crossing the mountain ridge in front of them, passing through the Song Kingdom, and passing through that small provincial city, they would come to a harsh and snowy land? That snowy land was where the Qing Kingdom had sent out its troops. After Northern Qi retreated and firmly defended it, countless people had fought and died. The great prince of the Qing Kingdom, who had rebelled against the Qing court alone and had been silent in the world for over a year, was now in the mountains that were as warm as spring. He stared straight at the sky and imagined the harsh wind and snow. Behind him were over 10,000 loyal subordinates. There was a black line in the mountains. It was the 4,000 Black Knights that Fan Xian had given him. However, Jing Ge led these Black Knights and did not seem to be willing to listen to him. If 13th Wang had not returned to Dongyi and brought Jing Ge Fan Xian's personally written military order, the Great Prince would not have been able to do anything to him. The Great Prince pulled back his gaze and glanced at 13th Wang beside him. There was not a trace of emotion on his heroic face. Although the number of soldiers he led was not large, it was the most powerful force that Dongyi relied on. If they joined the battle between the two countries, particularly if they fought their way out of the Song Kingdom that Shang Shanhu had miraculously taken last year, they would probably bring results that would shock the world. However, Fan Xian did not request or beg him to do this. Fan Xian only gave all of his power to his big brother. Then, through 13th Wang's mouth, he told him his analysis of the situation in the world. After that, he said nothing more. The Great Prince kicked his horse lightly. With a silent expression, he led the 10,000 elite soldiers toward the northwest. After a few breaths, the 4,000 Black Knights above the mountains also began to move with an eternally unchanging somberness and the aura of the netherworld. Immediately silent, he knew very well why Fan Xian did not have any specific words for him. He was the same as Fan Xian. Although they both had Dongyi blood, they were, after all, Qing people. Most of these 14,000 powerful elite soldiers were also Qing people. If the Qing Kingdom was on a northern expedition, were they going to betray the court and strike back? Probably no one would do such a thing. Although these people were all exiled and had no loyalty to the emperor, betraying the monarch and treason were, in the end, two different concepts. However, Dongyi could not just watch as the Qing emperor broke apart northern Qi in one go. If that happened, Dongyi would become the powerful Qing army's second target. In name, Dongyi already belonged to the Qing kingdom. Under Fan Xian and the Great Prince's power, the Qing court could not control this place. Once there was an opportunity to mobilize troops and truly conquer, the Qing court would not pass up the opportunity. At that time, Dongyi would be destroyed, and the Great Prince would only have death awaiting him. From the moment Qin Pingping died, the Great Prince had already mentally prepared himself for this. Now that he knew what Fan Xian was preparing to do in Jingdou, the Great Prince's heart still couldn't suppress the darkness. Regardless of whether Fan Xian won or lost, his mood would still be dark because that person was his father. His mother was still in the Qing royal palace, and his wife and concubines were still in Jingdou. The Great Prince slowly raised his head and looked in the direction of Jingdou. For a moment, he sighed. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he was silent for a long time without saying a word. The great battle had already begun. The charaba had already been laid out. Bones were buried in the road, blood and flesh splattered on the wilderness, and crows cried strangely in the wind and snow. Endless severity and danger enveloped the entire world. It was like a shadow that could not be moved away, covering the sky above the heads of millions of common people. Amidst such a tense situation, many people's gazes, including the valiant generals on the battlefield, the supreme emperor, and the solitary unfilial son, were actually all focused on Jingdo. They knew that the true victory or defeat, the direction of the world, was still in the Qing kingdom's Jingdo, between the father and son who were particularly cruel and merciless to others. Just as the Qing emperor had once said to Yuan, the life and death survival between him and Fan Xian was the true point of the game. However, this situation was not something a person could set up. Rather, it was the result of decades of karma and fate. In the process of this formation, the emperor himself, the dead woman, Chun Ping in the autumn rain, and even Fan Xian himself had all added fuel to the fire. Thus, in the end, there was no solution to this situation, and it became a dead end. Only a sword could cut the knot. Only life and death could release it. In Jingdo, watched by countless eyes, the common people did not feel much of the stench of blood on the front lines. They didn't even know about the shocking event happening in the imperial palace. Their emotions were calm as they passed their days as usual, other than the common people at the crossroads of the Tianhe, who were crying endlessly. In the scholar's manner, the scholar could not hear these cries, but he knew at the first instant what had happened in the royal palace. It was not a day for the court conference, but he still had enough spies and ranks, so he was immediately dumbfounded. A year ago, all of the officials of the He faction had been killed by Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council. During this year, the scholar led the Hall of Governmental Affairs, as well as the 3 temples, 3 schools, and 6 ministries. He managed the Qing court in good order. Even when the emperor was heavily injured and could not attend to matters, this scholar remained calm and indifferent. His expression did not change, even when Dong Mountain collapsed in front of him. He effectively maintained the peace of the Qing kingdom. However, when he learned of this news, all of the scholar's calmness immediately collapsed. He had not put on face cream, so the wrinkles on his face appeared particularly deep. Standing in a daze in the garden of the scholar's manor, he appeared particularly old. He prayed that the heavens would not bring any misfortune to the Qing kingdom. In a simple and crude private residence in another poor place in Jingdo, the previous Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, who had been released from prison a long time ago, was coughing and drinking medicine with the support of his daughter, the young lady of the Sun family. He had been tormented in prison to the point of almost dying. If it were not for a few madams in the Fan Manor secretly taking care of him, this stern Jingdo magistrate would probably have died long ago. However, the Sun family had long declined. Other than 3 generations of the family, all of the servants had left. The concubine had also escaped. Their days were truly unbearable. Sun Pinner comforted her father in a warm voice. In her heart, she was thinking that she would probably have to go to the Fan Manor to thank the princess for the medicine. However, she didn't have any clothes to wear. She also thought Sir Fan Jr. was now poor. Was he dead or alive? For a moment, she couldn't help but feel dazed. In the Fan Manor, Lin Wanner was sitting in the flower hall with a serious expression. Cece sat behind her. Each of them was holding a child. She said to the wife of the Tung family in front of her, "There is no need to escape. However, if the servants in the manor can scatter, then scatter as much as possible." The wife of the Tung family vaguely guessed something and was unwilling to leave. Lin Wanner would not force it. Even if these family members of the Fan clan wanted to leave, they would probably not be able to leave cleanly. She only looked in a daze at Fan Liang in her arms. Last night, Fan Ruo had been urgently summoned into the palace. Recently, there had been no news of the emperor being unwell. Lin Wanner immediately guessed something. In particular, since last night, the strange atmosphere that had begun to pervade the capital made her even more confident. "You're still alive. Why don't you go home and have a look? Even if Uncle wants to kill you, and you want to kill Uncle, but, were you not willing to let me see you one last time?" As soon as she thought of this, she was overcome with sadness. A few drops of tears fell from her eyes and landed on Fan Liang's puzzled face. While Lin Wanner was helplessly and sorrowfully worried about Fan Xian's life and death, Fan Ruo, who had been summoned into the palace last night, had successfully escaped the watch of the aces of the internal court and disappeared into the depths of the palace. The royal palace was in a mess. For a moment, it was impossible to find her whereabouts. It looked like this girl was not only successful in her studies on Qing Mountain. The training Wu Zhu gave her on that snowy night in the Tsang Mountains was far more successful than his teaching of Fan Xian. She was wearing the clothes of serving girl, but it gave off a moving feeling. Her clothes fluttered slowly in the light rain. Following the walls of the palace, she slowly walked in the direction of Taiji Palace. Along the way, she saw the eunuchs and serving girls, whose faces were pale from the sounds of fighting, sneaking in the direction of the rear palace. No one cared who she was or what she was doing there. Just as she was about to turn into a remote palace door in Taiji Palace, she saw eunuch Hongzhu. It seemed that Hongzhu had been waiting for her for a long time. The two of them looked at each other calmly. Fan Ruo looked calmly at Hongzhu. In reality, countless thoughts were running through her mind. She had no idea why a few months ago this popular chief eunuch had suddenly contacted her in secret. Hongzhu left the palace door with his body bent. He didn't explain anything because he had thought Sir Fan Jr. was already dead. After thinking for a long time, what little he had hidden in his bones finally allowed him to find the young lady of the Fan family and tell her about his relationship with Fan Xian. Perhaps this eunuch did not want her to guard the secret between him and Fan Xian and wait alone in the depths of the palace. Fan Ruo knew that her brother was still alive and had snuck into the royal palace with the help of this eunuch. This reality made her very happy. Immediately after, her joy turned into deep worry because she knew why her brother had entered the palace. She walked to the side of the palace gate and walked to the side of a large copper vat filled with water. Through the palace gate, she could hear the heart-palpitating sounds coming from the palace walls not far away. The sounds of iron drills piercing through armor and bones. The worry between her brows grew even heavier. She knew that even her teacher had come today. Then, through the crack in the palace door, she looked at the bright yellow figure in the distance in front of the main hall of Taiji Palace. She pressed her lips together slightly. After a long silence, she finally made up her mind. The emperor held his hands behind his back. His hands gripped the white handkerchief slightly tightly in his sleeves. Only he knew that the white handkerchief was stained with blood like peach blossoms. He had coughed up blood. Was he really going to die? Eunuch Yao had already been chased away by him. At this moment, there was not a single guard around him. Standing in front of the curtain of rain, he appeared very lonely. In the light rain in front of him, an even lonelier figure slowly walked over. Wu Zhu had finally come. The light rain continued to drip endlessly onto the black cloth on his face. The metal drill he held tightly in his hand continued to drip blood. An aura filled with the scent of blood seeped out from his soaked clothes. After killing an unknown number of imperial soldiers, Wu Zhu finally walked step by step from the direction of the royal palace to this place. The usually indestructible metal drill in his hand had pierced through countless tough armors and countless throats. At this moment, the sharp tip of the drill had been ground flat. The body of the drill had begun to bend. Wu Zhu was not human, but he was also not a god. In the face of the world's elite battle power, wave after wave, under the unscrupulous attacks, he was still injured. On the road down from the royal palace, the imperial soldiers wearing heavy armor used their bodies as giant rocks to control the enemy and blocked in front of him. They successfully delayed his steps and injured his body. The imperial soldiers' interception could not be said to not be heroic, but Wu Zhu still managed to kill his way out. Only the iron drill in his hand was already useless. His tightly bound black hair had long been disheveled. The cloth clothes on his body had even more holes. The clothes below his waist even more so. For some reason, had been burned into pieces. What was most frightening was that in the chaotic battle, the blind youth's leg seemed to have been broken by some heavy weapon. It was twisted to the side and back at an angle that did not conform to common sense. It looked like the bone had been twisted into a strange shape. It was impossible for him to walk. However, Wu Zhu continued to walk. Separated by the layer of black cloth that was about to fall off, he stared at the Qing emperor below. Using the deformed metal drill in his hand as a walking stick, he dragged his already useless left leg and walked with great difficulty and stubbornly in the rain until he reached the Qing emperor. The rain had long lightened and was pattering down. There was still water on the stone tiles in front of Taiji Palace. Wu Zhu's twisted left leg dragged in the rain and made a terrifying sound from the friction. With each friction, the corners of Wu Zhu's thin lips twitched slightly. Presumably, he also felt pain. However, he had already forgotten the pain. He only walked step by step toward the Qing emperor in front of the palace. The Qing emperor quietly watched Wu Zhu come closer and closer. Suddenly, he said, "I have finally confirmed that you are not an inanimate object. If you are an inanimate object, how could you have such powerful love and hate?" The tightly closed palace doors suddenly opened wide. Yi Zhong, covered in filth, rode on a horse. Leading the remaining imperial soldiers and his own family's riders, he rushed toward Taiji Palace. The sound of hooves was like thunder, shaking up the rainwater on the ground and making it tremble. In an instant, hundreds of Qing elite soldiers once again surrounded Wu Zhu. However, they looked at Wu Zhu, who was surrounded by them, at the man who was already twisted but still standing stubbornly. There was not a trace of joy in them. Particularly, the dozen or so Qing temple ascetic monks who had suddenly appeared beside the emperor. The powerful ascetic monks wearing straw hats paled and trembled all over when they saw Wu Zhu, particularly when they saw the color of the liquid flowing out of Wu Zhu's wounds. The blood flowing out of Wu Zhu's body was also hot and red. However, it was golden red, gradually fading in the light rain. Not many people noticed it. However, the ascetic monks wearing straw hats did. All of the ascetic monks seemed to have been struck by lightning. They knelt in the rain in front of Wu Zhu. They were the Qing emperor's most powerful personal defense. In this moment, they had no choice but to submit in front of this blind cripple. Chapter 768. On the second to last day, I have been writing slowly and ceaselessly. There will come a time when I finish. The rain slowly landed on the bamboo hats. The ascetic monks knelt on the wet ground with pale faces. They stared in a daze at the blind youth in the middle covered by a black cloth. For a long time, they could not make any reaction. They were the Qing emperor's last line of defense. When a dozen ascetic monks joined hands, even Fan Xian and the Shadow had almost been killed. It was clear how powerful they were. Now, facing Wu Zhu, would they turn around and attack? The emperor stood in the long corridor in front of the palace. The fine cold rain in the sky was blown by the wind to where he stood and wet the beard on his chin. He narrowed his eyes slightly. The coldness in them grew. Coldly, he said, "Useless things. A traitor from the temple has scared you so much." Strangely, the emperor did not seem worried that these ascetic monks would betray him at this moment. Many years ago, the emissary from the temple had made some kind of agreement with the emperor in order to remove all traces Yi Qingmei had left in this world. It was from that day onwards that the ascetic monks of the Qing temple who traveled the south saw the emperor as the true chosen one. Between the chosen one and the emissary of the temple, what choice should they make? The ascetic monks were silent. They, who were gradually getting older, knew of the oracle that the emissary had issued many years ago. They knew that an emissary had fallen, but they didn't know if that emissary was the person in front of them. The emperor paid no attention to the ascetic monks kneeling in the rain. He only looked calmly at Wu Zhu in the rain. After a moment of silence, he said, "There has never been a god in this world. I'm not. Lao Wu, you are not either." Wu Zhu's leg had already been broken. He used a poignant posture to barely stand. The person from the temple had returned to the world. Faced with the most powerful martial force in the world, he had bravely killed his way over. He had still paid a heavy price. The emperor was right. He was not a god. Thus, in this year, he had been betrayed one after another and injured by weapons that did not belong to this world. His injuries lingered, and he was no longer at his peak. However, Wu Zhu had already reached his most broken and powerless state. Who would win in the battle between these two peerless experts? Furthermore, Yizhong had already led his troops and surrounded Wu Zhu. Could Wu Zhu still break through the heavy encirclement and pierce the metal rod in his hand into the Qing Emperor's throat? The Emperor's cold gaze fell on Wu Zhu's tattered clothes and his broken left leg, which was only held together by some flesh and skin. There was not a trace of emotion in his eyes, but in his heart, he was thinking at this time, "You still won't come out." Gradually, a complicated emotion charged into the Qing Emperor's eyes. It was self-mockery, a glimmer of admiration, and a glimmer of dissatisfaction. Wu Zhu had already fallen into a tight encirclement. No matter how powerful he was, he could not overturn the heavens with one hand. Yet, Fan Xian still had not shown himself. Such coldness and forbearance was truly frightening. Wearing the clothes of a eunuch, Fan Xian appeared to be very far from the front door of Taiji Palace, but in reality, he was very close. He carefully hid his tracks. Relying on his state of mind, which had been tempered to the extreme these 2 years, he controlled his breathing. Using the wind and rain that filled the sky and the heavy and nervous breathing of countless people present, he slowly approached. From a moment he saw the Emperor cough, Fan Xian confirmed the top-secret intelligence he had learned on the road south. The Emperor's body seemed to be on the verge of death. It had been almost a year since he had seen this powerful ruler. Looking at him from afar through the rain, it seemed that his face had become much older. The beard on his chin had grown much longer, and his expression seemed much more tired. The Emperor had already walked down the altar. He stood calmly under the eaves of Taiji Palace and watched Wu Zhu walk over step by step. He still appeared powerful, so powerful that anyone who tried to challenge him would unconsciously lose a third of their confidence. Fan Xian saw Wu Zhu's wretched state. He had never thought that there would be a day when Uncle Wu Zhu would be so heavily injured, just as he had never thought that there would be someone in this world who could break through the defenses of the Qing royal palace, kill thousands of soldiers, and come in front of the Qing emperor. His gaze swept past Uncle Wu Zhu's broken leg. He forcefully suppressed his wildly beating heart and the glimmer of fear, worry, sadness, and bitterness in his heart. He continued to hide in the shadows of Taiji Palace, coldly and valiantly waiting for the opportunity to strike. Uncle Wu Zhu had already reached the most dangerous moment, but he still did not strike. He knew that before the Emperor and Wu Zhu collided head-on, any strike he made would be meaningless. A battle between great grandmasters was not something mortals like him could casually interfere in. He didn't want to waste Uncle Wu Zhu's earth-shattering attack, so he had to endure. Yizhong was still there, and Eunuch Yao was nowhere to be seen. He didn't know if those ascetic monks would strike. There were still many aces gathered in the royal palace. Fan Xian had to attract everyone's attention and put his hope of exhausting the emperor's strength on Uncle Wu Zhu, who was already on the verge of collapse and had suffered terrible injuries. Regardless of who it was, including the 3 old monsters who had already died and left, if they were to suffer such a serious injury as Wu Zhu had, they would probably only be able to accept death. However, Wu Zhu was still standing. This gave Fan Xian confidence, and it also gave the people in the royal palace boundless pressure. Separated by the black cloth, Wu Zhu looked at the bright yellow figure on the stone steps a dozen feet away. The man was already much older than he remembered. For some reason, endless sourness, pain, loathing, and disdain welled up in his heart. After the Dong Mountain matter ended and he listened to Fan Xian's drunken ramblings on the roof of the Fan Manor in Jingdou, Wu Zhu silently stepped onto the path of searching for himself. He wanted to know who he was, so he returned to the temple. The moment he entered the temple, he remembered many things. Naturally, he was able to deduce many things. Although the temple forcefully erased his memories in the next moment, as Fan Xian came to the temple, Wu Zhu's memories had not completely recovered. However, the deepest emotion he had before it was erased had remained. This emotion was stronger and more direct than his feelings for Fan Xian. It drew him to calmly look at the royal palace for 2 days. It drew him to kill his way into the palace from outside the square of the royal palace. Even though he didn't remember the events of the past, he still remembered the man wearing the dragon robe on the stone steps and the murderous intent he had toward this man. Fan Xian wanted Wu Zhu to follow his heart. Wu Zhu's heart was filled with boundless sourness, particularly after he saw Little Li. This sourness seemed to have found a way to vent. He was going to kill him. He only remembered this. Wu Zhu moved. He dragged his crippled leg and relied on the metal rod in his hand for support. With great difficulty, but full of murderous intent, he dragged it step by step, rubbing against the rainwater on the ground. His uninjured leg was impatient. It was as if he wanted to jump as he walked toward the emperor on the stone steps. The moment Wu Zhu moved, the aces of the Qing army surrounding him also moved. With an earth-shaking cry, countless long weapons pierced toward his body. The ascetic monks kneeling by Wu Zhu's side finally could not withstand this powerful pressure and also moved. Some ascetic monks floated back into the wind and rain, while others blocked in front of Wu Zhu. From this scene, it could be seen that the Qing emperor held a supreme position in these ascetic monks' hearts. Even though they knew Wu Zhu was an emissary from the temple, the Qing emperor's call of a traitor still made some ascetic monks choose to believe the emperor. Wu Zhu moved. The situation immediately changed. No one noticed that when most of the ascetic monks between the emperor and Wu Zhu floated back into the wind and rain, opening up a path for Wu Zhu to face the emperor directly, an ascetic monk wearing a straw hat and hemp clothing floated diagonally to the side and back. Intentionally or not, he disturbed the attacks of the military aces. The moment Wu Zhu moved, Yi Zhong, who sat on his horse with a spear in hand, gathered his qi around his entire body. The moment Wu Zhu moved, killing intent flared in his eyes. He kicked the horse's belly. The horse neighed. The long spear moved like lightning toward Wu Zhu's slightly slanted back. Of the people present, probably only Yi Zhong had experienced the events in Qing Kingdom's Jingdou many years ago. Thus, he knew better than anyone else how terrifying Wu Zhu was. He was a powerful warrior who could face Uncle Luyan head-on and not be at a disadvantage. Once he made up his mind to protect the emperor, he gathered all the strength in his body and did not hold anything back. He knew that when faced with Sir Wu, other than using all his strength in one spear strike, there was no other way to stop his seemingly staggering footsteps. With an explosive roar, a silver spear light, as pure as water, pierced toward Wu Zhu's back. Yi Zhong had unleashed the most powerful attack of his life. All of his spirit and spirit were focused on this attack, so he did not notice that the ascetic monk, who had lightly floated back into the wind and rain, seemed to be a little too close to his body. Ascetic monks never used weapons, but the ascetic monk closest to Yi Zhong had taken out a poisoned dagger from his sleeve at some point. Silently, like a strand of rain hidden in the rain, it gently pierced toward Yi Zhong's waist. Yi Zhong stabbed Wu Zhu's back, and the ascetic monk stabbed his waist. With a swoosh, Yi Zhong's spear strike, which he had gathered strength, pierced forward without any flourish. It ignored all resistance and pierced directly into the stone floor of the royal palace that had been washed clean by the rain. It was like piercing a piece of tofu. The tip of the spear stabbed ruthlessly into the ground, sinking several feet deep. However, the poisoned black dagger had already pierced into his waist the moment his spear was fully unleashed. Yi Zhong's spear missed. It brushed past the cloth beside Wu Zhu's broken leg and pierced into the ground. Immediately after, a shrill roar rang out in the rain. He abandoned the spear and pulled back his palm, which landed on the ascetic monk's shoulder. Using the coffin breaker technique, the ascetic monk's shoulder immediately shattered. However, the ascetic monk did not make a sound or feel pain. Like an emotionless wooden man, he took the palm of Yi Zhong, a superior 9th-level ace. As blood sprayed wildly from his mouth, He pushed the dagger in his hand forward and completely broke through the defense of Yi Zhong's armor, heavily injuring his abdomen. A wave of energy exploded between the two of them, shaking the Qing military aces beside them to the ground. The two of them were like a large bird and its shadow, quickly flying off their horses and slamming into the rain. They broke through countless layers of rain and flew into the distance. Yi Zhong was crippled. At least for today, the assassin was the shadow. When the ascetic monk silently hid from the eyes of the Qing aces present and used the rain to get close to Yi Zhong's back, Fan Xian, who had been watching everything in the dark, immediately sensed a strange atmosphere. This was an innate sensitivity of the people of the Overwatch Council. In the world, probably only he and the shadow could reach such a level. After Fan Xian entered the capital, he had not contacted the shadow because even he didn't know where the shadow had been hiding this year. However, he knew that the shadow would not be satisfied. The foremost assassin in the world would get revenge for Chen Pingping. Thus, the palace was in chaos. Fan Xian knew that the shadow, who was somewhere, would certainly find an opportunity to attack. However, he had not thought that the shadow would be mixed in with the ascetic monks. A year ago, the two of them had fought a major battle with the ascetic monks. How the shadow had been able to mix in was something Fan Xian did not understand. However, at least at this moment, the shadow had successfully eliminated the foremost ace by the Qing Emperor's side and pulled the victory in their favor. If this had been any other mission in the past, it would have been the most important target in the mission for the shadow to attack. Even Fan Xian could not compete with him on this, just like the last attack when he entered the palace to assassinate Yi Zhong. However, the shadow had silently retreated and chosen Yi Zhong of his own accord because he had discovered that the first commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Sir Wu, had come. The shadow, who had viewed Wu Zhu as his idol, naturally chose to cooperate with Wu Zhu. This was actually a kind of trust. Fan Xian's gaze only swept over Yi Zhong and the shadow, who were breaking through the rain and endlessly charging away from the battlefield. He then turned back to the battlefield in front of Taiji Palace. The moment Yi Zhong was attacked, the people in front of Taiji Palace couldn't help but panic. The attacks aimed at Yi Zhong's immobile body also became slightly chaotic. The only one who did not panic was the Emperor. He completely ignored the ascetic monk's attack. He only stared fixedly at Yi Zhong's hand. The Emperor only had Wu Zhu in his eyes. The incomparably hard metal rod had already been bent, damaged, and smoothed out. It looked like a very common fire stick. However, this fire stick carried the rain in front of Taiji Palace and waved it through the air to its heart's content. With a slap, the metal rod knocked aside a long spear in front of it. In the shortest amount of time, it followed the most logical direction and slammed into the wrist of the person holding the spear. In that instant, the skin on the wrist of the person holding the spear split open. His muscles shattered, and his bones protruded. He could no longer hold the spear. With a crack, the metal rod slid up along the surface of the sword. The heavy pressure forced the sword to lower its head. The metal rod, which no longer had any edge, touched the protruding part of the sword. It suddenly jumped up and then landed heavily on the arm of the person holding the sword, directly turning the arm into twisted firewood. An ascetic monk waved his hand to block it. The metal rod, which had been ground into a flat surface, ruthlessly pierced into his palm, pressing his palm into the rain-covered ground. Then, the metal rod swung up and smashed heavily into the top of the ascetic monk's head. The bamboo hat, along with the rainwater, shattered into countless pieces. A mark formed by blood appeared on the ascetic monk's smooth head. With a crack, he collapsed into the rainwater. Each swing of the metal rod was accurate and heavy. The metal rod, which had long lost its edge, became a metal stick in Wu Zhu's hand. It knocked aside the densely packed swords in front of him and shattered countless joints. Blood mixed with the rainwater and splashed into the air in front of him. The metal rod could no longer pierce into the throats of the countless aces in the royal palace, but it could shatter their throats. Wu Zhu, who advanced with difficulty in the rain, seemed to be able to fall at any moment. However, the ones who fell in the end were the aces bravely blocking in front of the emperor. At this moment, Wu Zhu seemed to have become the serious teacher on the cliff. Every time he swung his staff, it would accurately land on Fan Xian's body. No matter how Fan Xian tried to dodge, he would never be able to. But today, the wooden staff had become an iron staff. With a muffled thud, the cartilage on an internal court guard's knee was shattered by the metal rod. He knelt by Wu Zhu's side. The metal rod swung down again and smashed the person down the stone steps, sending up rainwater. Wu Zhu finally stood in front of the emperor. Without pausing, cursing, or making eye contact, Wu Zhu raised his hand. The metal rod in his hand smashed down toward the emperor's face. No one in the world dared to slap the emperor's face, but Wu Zhu did so. Furthermore, he did so as if it was a matter of course. It was as if he was teaching an unfilial son a lesson or beating a heartless man. When Wu Zhu stood in front of the emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. A certain light suddenly bloomed on his slightly aged face. Then he also raised his hand. In the instant that the rain did not even have time to tremble, the emperor's left hand, which had been hanging by his side the entire time, suddenly appeared by his face. His palm faced outward and blocked the metal rod. At the same time, the emperor's right hand formed a fist and smashed viciously into Wu Zhu's chest. His most terrifying pair of hands were as white as snow, seemingly forever untainted by dust and untainted by blood. They blocked Wu Zhu's metal drill and struck Wu Zhu's body. The first exchange between the last two ultimate warriors in the world, who had transcended the limits of humanity, was this simple. They each swung a stick, blocked a palm, and threw a punch. If it had been anyone other than the two of them, they would not have been able to block that metal rod and throw that punch. The emperor's terrifying fist smashed viciously into Wu Zhu's chest. The air seemed to have frozen at this moment. Wu Zhu's body seemed to be strangely suspended in the air at this moment. Then, like an arrow, he was fiercely smashed out. Like a heavy and hard meteorite, he flew out from the bottom of the stone steps. Wu Zhu's body smashed into countless pursuing Qing aces along the way. In front of Taiji Palace in the royal palace, where a black shadow passed, flesh and blood flew everywhere. With a muffled thud, Wu Zhu's body finally landed dozens of feet away. He landed heavily on the ground and shook the world around him. The entire place fell into a strange silence. At this moment, there weren't many people who were still alive and standing. Below Taiji Palace, on the stone steps, in the light rain, the lonely and proud emperor still maintained his posture with one palm in front of him and one fist extended in the air. Knocking Wu Zhu down with one punch was something worthy of the Qing emperor's pride. However, there was not a trace of emotion on his face. On the contrary, a glimmer of coldness appeared in his eyes. Wu Zhu's metal rod had shattered the powerful Jinqi the Qing emperor had attached to his palm and ruthlessly struck the Qing emperor's face. The Qing emperor's face was very pale, but his left cheek was red and swollen. Fresh blood flowed from the corner of his lips. It was like someone had slapped him heavily in the face. He slowly pulled back his left hand and lowered his head to look at the metal rod marks on his palm. Only then did he remember that Wu Zhu's metal rod was bent. Wu Zhu, in the puddle of blood and rain, suddenly moved. Then, with unusual difficulty, he stood up with his bent body. The metal rod in his hand trembled as it stood on the ground, supporting his tottering body as he stood in the rain. He had walked this far with incomparable difficulty. He had walked to the emperor's side only to be knocked back by a punch from the emperor. This was something that was enough to make anyone despair. However, Wu Zhu's expression did not change at all. He only dragged his even more broken left leg and, using an even more difficult posture and even slower speed, once again walked toward the bright yellow figure below Taiji Palace. Chapter 769. That the Qing Emperor's fist was always steady and powerful. It was full of the aura of a ruler. It easily pierced through all obstacles in front of it, just as he often did in this life. In the decades of history in this land, not many people had survived an attack from the Qing Emperor. Sigu Jian, that strange old creature, had his intestines torn apart and could only rely on Fei Jie's strange poison to struggle at death's door. However, Fan Xian had relied on the magic coup he had left behind to move dozens of feet in one move. Contrary to the Qing Emperor's expectations, he had forcefully avoided the terrifying power contained within the fist. Wu Zhu did not avoid this punch. He had truly withstood the boundless Xinqi in the Qing Emperor's body. A part of his chest caved in, but he did not fall. If the highest realm in the world was a great grandmaster, then if the only weakness of a great grandmaster was that they were still like immortals, then Wu Zhu clearly did not have this weakness. His body was certainly the most powerful among the great grandmasters. He only stood up again and moved closer to the Qing Emperor on the wet ground. He once again walked in front of the Qing Emperor. The black cloth on his face did not move. The metal drill in his hand waved and broke through the air noiselessly. Because it was too fast, the people who were struggling to survive could not see what was happening on the stone steps or hear any sound. The Emperor did not retreat. A faint gray light flashed through his eyes. His feet stood steadily on the stone steps. Just as he had declared with boundless dominance and confidence in the Hanging Temple, he had never retreated half a step in his life, regardless of what enemy he faced. He punched again. His jade-like fist glowed with a faint light. In an instant, it evaporated all the moisture in the air and landed squarely on Wu Zhu's abdomen. Wu Zhu's metal rod was like a streak of clear light cast down from the sky. It could not be stopped. It struck ruthlessly against the Qing Emperor's left shoulder. For warriors of their realm, in the last battle of their lives, they had long cast aside all external pretense and techniques. In the word power, the power was already in their bodies and bearing. They collided purely with reality. It was just like what Master Ku He's great ancestor, Jin Shun, had said in one of the sayings, "Take off your clothes and go." The duel between the two peerless experts was just the most indifferent and simple performance art. Without any external appearance, it was just like primitive people practicing the most perfect killing skills in the snow, beside the volcano, and in the midst of grassland beasts. The Emperor's left shoulder shattered with a crack. Fresh blood seeped out from between his lips. His cold eyes only watched Wu Zhu's figure flying further and further away. Wu Zhu was once again sent flying by that fist. His leg had been broken, and his body was crippled. His unimaginably calculating ability could no longer be supported by the powerful execution of his body. He could not dodge the Qing Emperor's fist that broke through the boundaries of time and space. In the light rain that was about to stop, Wu Zhu's body arched as he retreated backward in the air. The cold wind caused his clothes to flutter. With a paw, his feet landed on the ground. He slid backward over 100 feet on the slippery ground before he managed to stop. However, his left leg couldn't support him, and he almost fell to the ground. After taking this punch head-on, Wu Zhu did not fall to the ground. It seemed that his situation was better than before. However, the incomparable confidence and powerful light on the Emperor's face, as well as Wu Zhu's slightly lowered head, seemed to indicate an inauspicious ending. Wu Zhu stood quietly in the pool of blood below Taiji Palace. He lowered his head to look at his abdomen and was silent for a long time. Before the Emperor's fist struck his abdomen, Wu Zhu had blocked his left hand. Thus, the Emperor's fist had actually struck his palm and then his abdomen. Wu Zhu's hand was like an icy piece of metal. His body was also like an icy ball of metal. However, the Qing Emperor's fist was like a god's hammer, smashing the metal into the ball of metal. His palm had sunk deep into his abdomen, like two pieces of metal being forcefully glued together. The corner of his brows that was not covered by the black cloth furrowed slightly. Coldly, Wu Zhu pulled at his left hand. He didn't know how much strength he used before he managed to pull his hand out from his abdomen. However, it brought up a large patch of pale flesh that was no longer bleeding. Accompanied by the sound of tearing, it appeared unusually terrifying. The Qing Emperor's first punch landed on Wu Zhu's chest. He didn't block it. The second punch landed on his abdomen. He did not block it. Two different choices represented two completely different levels of damage. It seemed that the vital points of the emissaries of the temple were no longer a secret in the eyes of that powerful ruler. This reality made Wu Zhu somewhat stunned. It also made the spectators, who were still enduring and shivering, begin to feel boundless fear. Propping the metal rod on the blood-soaked and rain-soaked ground, Wu Zhu used his left hand to straighten his almost broken left leg. With great difficulty, he took a step toward Taiji Palace. His cloth shoe stepped on the hand of a corpse and almost slipped. A crisp crack rang out from Wu Zhu's abdomen. It was as if a spiderweb of cracks were spreading out and tearing through his body with that spot as the center. Wu Zhu's body began to tremble and tilt. It was as if he could become countless pieces at any moment, fall apart, and collapse into a pool on the ground. However, the metal drill rod was still tightly gripped in his hand, supporting his tottering body valiantly, allowing him to take another step forward. Even his first step was so difficult, so slow, accompanied by some extremely dry sounds. However, he still walked step by step towards the emperor without hesitation. The emperor pulled back his fist. His indifferent and emotionless eyes glanced at his chest. It was as if he wanted to count how many of his ribs had been shattered by that hard metal rod. He didn't remember how many punches he had thrown out or how much blood he had spat out. He only remembered that he didn't take a step back, but he didn't advance either. He just stood like a puppet on the stone steps in front of his palace and threw out his punches mechanically and repeatedly. How many times had the fifth prince fallen? How many times had he gotten up? How many times had he fallen in his life? How many times had he gotten up? Why was the fifth prince clearly about to fall, yet he struggled to get up? Did he not know that a monster like him would one day truly die? If the fifth prince was not a dead thing, but a living thing, knew about life and death and feared it, then why didn't he show it? Why was it that the fifth prince's movements had clearly slowed down so much, yet the hard metal rod in his hand was always able to smash into his body? Was it because he was already old and was about to run out of oil? No, it couldn't be. It shouldn't be. Dissatisfaction and indignation burned faintly in his cold eyes. In the end, it turned into endless tiredness and boredom. Was this a shocking battle destined to be recorded in the annals of history, or a small show destined to disappear in a long river of history? Regardless of which it was, the Qing emperor was tired of it. It was just like how many years after his father ascended the throne, he was forced to painfully prepare for the matter of Taiping Courtyard. A few years later, there was going to be a night of blood in Jingdou. The great Dong Mountain lured and killed those two old things. And Ji lured and killed those shameless people who dared to betray him in Jingdou. Last year, he wanted to lure the chest out. Now, the fifth prince was here. Endless schemes and plots were like the fifth prince in front of him falling and rising again. They repeated endlessly. It was like a story from many years ago, stubbornly replayed over and over again. This kind of repetition was truly annoying and tiresome. However, the Qing emperor could not be tired. He was not willing to be tired. He still had many things to do. He had not defeated the most powerful enemy in front of him. He could not let go. Slowly wiping away the blood that gushed endlessly from the corners of his lips, the emperor suddenly felt his body grow slightly cold. A year ago, he had been heavily injured and had not recovered. At times, he was afraid of the cold, light, and wind. Thus, he was willing to lie on the soft couch and cover himself with the silk blanket Warner had brought from Jiangnan. He liked that warm feeling and didn't like this cold feeling. It made him feel powerless and tired. It seemed that as the blood flowed away, the temperature and confidence in his body also flowed away. Looking at Wu Zhu, who had once again climbed to his feet, the broken Wu Zhu, the emperor's burning eyes suddenly lit up. Following the sudden paleness, his old face appeared unusually thin and sallow. The rain had stopped. The dark clouds in the sky were turning into white clouds at a speed visible to the naked eye. They grew whiter and whiter, more and more beautiful and brighter. The air in the square of the royal palace was filled with the beautiful aura of rain washing the blue sky. Beyond the palace walls, in the extreme eastern sky line, something beautiful was faintly happening. The emperor opened his hazy eyes. With a shake of his clothes, he finally flew up from the stone steps of Taiji Palace. In this rainless sky, he brought up a stream of rain parallel to the south, leaving behind countless afterimages in the air. The blue sky reflected this dragon of rain. A draconic cry seemed to ring out from somewhere in the royal palace. Wu Zhu, who was holding the metal drill, was immediately surrounded by this dragon and countless draconic cries. The gray, solemn, and beautiful rainwater that broke through the air instantly launched its most powerful attack toward Wu Zhu. Other than the two powerful warriors present, no one could see clearly what was happening in that curtain of rain. However, the dragon's cry had died out. After a terrifying moment of absolute silence, countless sounds rang out one after another like a string of thunder. It was also like the wind high up in the sky instantly blowing through the yellow paper lanterns put out by countless lovers. Pop, 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 Wu Zhu finally fell. He fell under the Qing Emperor's storm-like punches and fingers. In this instant, his body had suffered countless heavy blows. Finally, he sat down weakly at the Qing Emperor's feet. His pale right hand opened toward the sky. There was nothing there. The long, silent, and noble head also drooped down powerlessly and fell in front of the Qing Emperor. Reluctantly and helplessly, he let go of the hand holding the metal drill. But the metal drill did not fall to the ground of the royal palace. It made the clear sound of a funeral bell because the metal drill was stuck in the Qing Emperor's abdomen and was trembling slightly. Fresh blood surged out of the Qing Emperor's abdomen and flowed down the metal drill. It dripped down the smooth tip of the drill and landed on Wu Zhu's pale palm. Following a clear line of life, it gradually bloomed into a beautiful peach blossom. The emperor's thin and emotionless lips were slightly parted. They appeared slightly dry. His face was deathly pale. His eyes were empty and without a trace of emotion. He lowered his head to look at the metal drill in his abdomen. Feeling boundless exhaustion and annoyance, he prepared to pull out the metal drill that had sunk deep into his abdomen. He was the person with the greatest willpower in the world. At the beginning, his meridians had all been shattered. Even the pain of being a cripple could not weaken his spirit at all, much less the pain in his abdomen. He knew that Lao Wu was already crippled. A faint pride flashed through his eyes, but there was only boundless exhaustion. He discovered that his lips were beginning to taste something rusty. Fan Xian still had not appeared. This reality confused the emperor. A glimmer of a self-mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. It looked like his son's state of mind was stronger than he had imagined. Because of his strength, he had been cold, callous, and cold-blooded, enduring silently until now. He had watched as Wu Zhu was crippled by him, but still refused to come out. Strangely, the emperor once again felt admiration for his son. He seemed to feel that his most unfilial son was becoming more and more like himself, as cold-blooded as himself. He had thought that Fan Xian should have come out a long time ago. When Wu Zhu first fell to the ground, or when Wu Zhu's leg was broken in two, he had been secretly preparing for this. However, Fan Xian had not come out, so he felt a faint disappointment and an ominous feeling. Was the blue sky after the rain going to witness the emperor's final failure? Was she going to use her son's eyes to see his failure? Fresh blood surged out from the powerful emperor's lips and from his abdomen. He once again felt the coldness and began to think of the soft blanket on the couch and the woman in the royal study. Then his right hand gripped the metal drill steadily and began to slowly pull it out of his body with a heart-shaking coldness. There is an old saying that when a blade was pulled out of a wound, the pain was the greatest. This could be used to refer to life, but it could also be used to refer to the current situation. When the emperor slowly pulled out the metal drill, it was like exposing the scars that had been hidden in the darkness by his mask all these years. The scars that he thought had long healed made him think of many people and many things. The pain made his pale face even whiter, so white that it was not like a normal person's. It seemed like even this monarch's arm couldn't bear to let him face this kind of pain. Therefore, at this moment, in the cold and clean air, an extremely strange twist suddenly occurred. It was a twist and separation of bone and flesh. It did not conform to the structure of the human body at all. It bent out at a strange angle. It was rather like Wu Zhu's leg. Blood blossomed under the blue sky. Bone and flesh separated from the Qing emperor's body. His left arm was neatly cut off from the elbow joint by a mysterious force. Under the light of the clear sunlight, the severed arm flew into the spotless air. With the slowest speed, it spun, jumped, danced, and danced with beads of blood at the stump. Only then did the clear sound of a gunshot echo through the empty royal palace courtyard. It curled up in spirals and was lonely and clear. It was like a sorrowful accompaniment to the dancing of the severed arm. Other than losing to Zhang Qingfeng on the northern expedition, the meridians in his body shattered, and the days when he sank into darkness. This moment was the most painful and weakest moment of the emperor's life. The gunshot, which had been silent for decades, and then silent for another year, finally rang out in the royal palace. After a year of silence, and another morning of silence, Fan Xian's figure finally appeared by the emperor's side. Watching as Wu Zhu was heavily injured by the emperor until he became useless, Fan Xian still did not come out. What kind of pain was he suppressing? However, when he appeared, he chose the most opportune moment and appeared in the most opportune place. He appeared directly beside the emperor. All he needed was the snap of a finger. His 20-odd years of bitter cultivation after being reborn, his motivation between life and death on the meadow, his will to not despair in the desperate situation in the snowy palace, his comprehension under the tree, his thoughts in the snowy plains, the creation of a Yuanqi of heaven and earth, life and death, separation and separation, the clash between weak and valiant, a life of craving life and hating death, and the pain of the autumn rain all merged into one feeling. An aura exploded out of Fan Xian's body. There was no sword, no arrow, no dagger, no poisonous smoke, no small tricks, no coffin breaker, no stretching out of his arm against the path of the sword, and no channeling of his qi against the path of heaven and earth. Fan Xian abandoned everything. He only turned himself into a gust of wind and a streak of gray light. In the shortest of moments, he forced out all of his power through his fingers and chopped toward the emperor's heavily injured and weak body. The powerful tyrannical Jinshi did not hesitate to cut the already thick meridians in his body. With a decisive stance and a speed beyond his ability, it fiercely sent out. Countless streaks of smoke and dust lit up the cold autumn. He sent it to his fingers. The Jinshi did not spit it out. Instead, it gathered it inside. The sword qi did not leave his fingers, but it was as solid as metal and stone. Viciously, it pierced into the emperor's shoulder. Moving it to his palm, the Jinshi was like the wind of the East Sea. It surged out violently and swept through the clean jade mountain. Without leaving a single speck of dust, it slammed heavily into the emperor's chest. Chopping finger and palm, he chopped away the past of these years. He pointed out a path of life and death. With a single palm, he separated the line between ruler and official, father and son. Fan Xian had never been so powerful in his life. The Qing emperor had never been so weak. This pair of father and son didn't even have time to meet each other's eyes for an instant before they became two shadows in front of Taiji Palace. They made the intimacy of life and death with each other. It was as if countless yellow paper lanterns in the air had been torn apart by the strong wind. They popped endlessly, causing one's heart to palpitate with boredom. The speed of Fan Xian's movements had already risen to a level that would make people dumbfounded. He did not leave any afterimages. There was only a wisp of gray shadow that circled around the emperor's body. In an instant, he had attacked dozens or hundreds of times. The rainwater that had accumulated on the stone floor suddenly seemed to have been split open by a water-repellent bead. It spread to the sides, revealing the clean stone tiles in the middle. About half a palm's length above the stone tiles, the Emperor and Fan Xian's figures flew through the air. In an instant, they left the front of Taiji Palace and flew like lightning toward the northeast. Water splashed everywhere along the way. A trail of blood flew through the air in a line. With a bang, the bright yellow figure dispiritedly smashed through the palace doors between the walls of the royal palace, shattering the thick palace doors and filling the air with wood shavings. The wood shavings shot out in all directions like powerful arrows. With a series of sizzling sounds, they shot through the circular stone doors behind the palace doors and sent up a wave of stone shavings. They embedded deeply into the vermilion palace walls. It was the wood shavings shooting out from all directions beside the bright yellow figure that forced Fan Xian, who was like a soul-chasing wind and soul-chasing shadow, to slow down and reveal his body in the air. The bright yellow figure smashed through the palace doors, and immediately after, he crashed heavily into the large copper water vat between the walls. With a muffled sound, he also revealed his body. The hand that was still not stained with blood broke through the air, and with a pa sound, a slender wrist was shaken off. Like lightning, he pulled out the ice-cold metal, flipped his wrist up, and pinched that soft throat. Then it gripped the serving girl's throat. With a splat, the Emperor leaned dejectedly and weakly against the side of the large copper vat and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. However, a faint and strange smile rose to his pale face. One of his arms was already broken. There were 4 or 5 finger holes and 3 palm prints on his body. Fresh blood dyed the dragon robe on his body, making the golden dragon on his bright yellow clothes appear particularly ferocious, but also particularly wretched. Fan Xian slowly put down the bridge of his left hand and right fist that covered his face. The wood shavings also caused blood to seep endlessly out of his clothes. He coughed violently and coughed up threads of blood. The attack earlier was an attack that he had condensed his life into. At this moment, he was forced to stop. It was already impossible for him to unleash that mysterious speed. Furthermore, a large portion of his meridians had been cut. They were like countless little knives scraping through his body. The pain was difficult to endure. The Emperor's injuries were even more serious. It was so serious that it seemed like he could disappear from this world at any moment. However, there was not a glimmer of joy on Fan Xian's face. After a series of hurried coughs, his expression recovered its calm. Looking at the Emperor, who was leaning against the copper vat and gasping for breath, he didn't say a word. However, his eyes revealed his true emotions. They were complicated. He stared at the Emperor in a daze. He kept feeling that the scene in front of him was not real. The Emperor, who was as high and unreachable as a snowy mountain, bone-chilling and powerful and indestructible, would also have a time when he was at the end of his rope. When did the Emperor's appearance become so old? Your Majesty, you've lost. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and used the sleeve of his eunuch robe to wipe away the blood at the corner of his lips. He looked at the Emperor with a complicated gaze. The words he said were meaningless. There were at least a dozen wounds on the Qing Emperor's body, particularly the cut on his left arm and the wound on his abdomen. Fresh blood gushed out endlessly. Just as the Emperor had said to Wu Zhu earlier, there were no immortals in this world. Wu Zhu was not, and neither was he. The betrayal, assassination, and injuries he had suffered this year had dragged on until now. Now, he had fought a heaven-shaking battle with Wu Zhu, had his arm cut off by the heavy sniper rifle, and had been ambushed by Fan Xian, who was faintly breaking through. Even the most powerful ruler in the world had reached his final moments. A glimmer of a mocking and cold smile still hung on the Emperor's face. His 3 fingers continued to gently rest on the serving girl's throat. The serving girl held a gun in her hand. The Emperor glanced at Fan Xian, but did not pay attention to his words. Instead, in a raspy voice and coughing up blood, he looked at Fan Ro beside him with a warm gaze. After looking calmly for a long time, he said, "As I said, it is not easy to be a good emperor. First, You have to abandon some unnecessary emotions and cannot be soft-hearted. Ruoro, you are soft-hearted today. This is a fatal mistake. The face of the young lady of the Fan family, dressed in serving girl attire, remained calm. However, her slightly furrowed brows showed that her heart was not as calm as her appearance. Since last autumn, she had been taken into the royal palace by the emperor. She had always accompanied this lonely ruler in the royal study. Day after day, she had seen too many times the thin figure reading memorials under the oil lamp, heard too many coughs coming from the sickbed, and seen too many times the thin old man's furrowed brows. Gradually, on the 8th day of the new year, on a snowy day, she had been in Jiaxing Tower, looking through the glass at the bright yellow figure in the distance. She had always felt that it was unreal, so her fingers had not trembled in the slightest. Now, through the crack in the palace doors, looking at the gradually aging and familiar face of the emperor, for some reason, she had chosen to aim at the emperor's arm and not at a fatal point. The emperor was right. In that instant, Fan Ruo's heart softened a little. Girls are extroverted. Chun Girl has tried endlessly to soften my resolve this year, but I ignored it. You like that scoundrel in Xi, I know that. However, have you girls ever thought about whether, in this year, you have softened me or been softened by me? The emperor spoke calmly and indifferently. He did not summon the internal court eunuchs he had exiled to the back palace. He also did not stop the bleeding. It was as if he did not care at all about the blood flowing out of his body. A slightly mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. Fan Ruo's body trembled slightly. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the emperor in front of him, who was both familiar and strange and had a complicated relationship with him. He didn't know what kind of shock rose in his mind. His admiration for the emperor's willpower and scheming reached a peak. In such a dangerous moment earlier, the emperor had appeared defeated under his desperate attack. In reality, he had still chosen the best path. He had broken through the palace doors, found the person holding the spear, and taken control of her. Fan Xian pressed his thin lips together tightly. Suddenly, he gritted his teeth and said, "Your Majesty, don't try to use her life to threaten me. You will accept my threat?" The emperor asked in a mocking tone as he slowly turned his head and allowed the blood to soak into his dragon robe. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then shook his head. Looking at Fan Ruo, he said in a raspy voice, "If you die, I will accompany you." Fan Ruo's face was slightly pale. After a moment of silence, she said, "Sister, you are not afraid of death. Is escaping the fear of life and death something remarkable?" The emperor stared into Fan Xian's eyes and suddenly laughed softly. "Your face is like your mother's, but your lips are a bit like mine, extremely thin and heartless." It is indeed true. A moment later, the indifferent emperor suddenly said, "In my life, I have never lost." For some reason, after Fan Xian was reborn, he always possessed a calmness, even coldness, that normal people did not have. However, at such a tense moment, when he heard the emperor's words, a sliver of sourness, emptiness, and anger welled up from the depths of his heart. In a cold voice, he roared loudly at the emperor, "Enough!" The emperor looked calmly into his son's eyes. He looked at his handsome face that was slightly twisted in anger. Suddenly, he laughed coldly. It was as if he was laughing at the other party's loss of composure, the other party's fear, and the strange anger that came from nowhere. In the empty royal palace, other than the rainwater still accumulating on the ground and the countless corpses and flesh, there were only 4 people left standing. Fan Xian stood by Uncle Wu Zhu's side and stared coldly at the bright yellow figure not far away. No one knew what he was thinking. He was indeed afraid, but the anger was not born out of fear. Instead, it was born out of another sense of sorrow. From there to here, the distance was very short. Fan Xian seemed to have an opportunity to attack. However, the emperor was within 3 feet of Fan Ruo's side. No one dared to take such a risk in front of a great grandmaster. Fan Ruo still held that heavy sniper rifle in her hand. Everyone could see that the emperor was at the end of his rope and was on the verge of death. I have never lost in my life. The emperor looked at the sun in front of him and Wu Zhu in front of him. He slowly raised his sleeve to wipe away the blood at the corner of his lips. Coldly, he said, "I just feel as if I am going to die." Failure and death were two different concepts. Failure was victory and defeat, but life and death often belonged to fate. A ruler's failure would certainly lead to his death. A ruler's death was not necessarily because he had failed. Perhaps the Qing emperor was already surrounded by the aura of death, but he had not failed. His death had actually been predestined a long time ago. There was no true path of kings in the world. The emperor's body had been disturbed by ruthless Zhenshi these years, making it impossible for him to rest. The many things that had happened this year had allowed the Zhenshi to find a way to harm him in his body. It quickly destroyed his life force and sped up the process of his aging. However, the emperor's slightly sunken eyes looked coldly at Fan Xian. He did not lightly speak of the truth that was destined to shock him endlessly. "Even if I die, I will kill you, unfilial son." The emperor coughed, making him bend slightly. There was a faint unwillingness in his coughs. The Li family's kingdom is destined to unify the world. As long as you die, regardless of which of my two sons takes the throne, the world will still belong to the Qin kingdom. The raging flames of war outside Nanjing were only flames that forced Fan Xian to appear. Otherwise, if Fan Xian returned from the temple and went into hiding, where would the Qing emperor go to find him? However, if Fan Xian did not die, the great work of the Qing kingdom for thousands of generations would not appear. Even if the Qing emperor knew that his body was about to weaken, how could he be at ease? The situation today was just a ruler wanting to kill his official and a father wanting to kill his son. Who would have thought that the situation would change in the royal palace? In the lonely royal palace, the emperor faced all of the enmity alone. The emperor felt a bit tired. He looked at Fan Xian calmly and suddenly realized that the desire to kill his son was not as strong as he had imagined. Why was this? Perhaps the source of the emperor's desire to kill was the anger he felt because of Fan Xian's betrayal and not for the Qin kingdom for thousands of generations. An emperor without meridians and a heartless person. Once he became angry because of disappointment and moved, he was nothing more than a mortal. The emperor suddenly felt that if he died like this, he would probably be very lonely. What kind of cold gaze would his relatives in the netherworld, Changqian, Chengze, and the empress look at him? Would his mother be well in the netherworld? After that woman's death, would her spirit still look at him with that seemingly gentle but actually incomparably distant gaze? A sense of loneliness and desolation took over the old emperor's body. He suddenly realized that in the last battle of his life, he was still facing her spear, her servant, her and his son. After struggling for a lifetime, in the end, he was still fighting her. Thinking of this, a glimmer of a sorrowful smile rose to the emperor's face. Was he destined to lose to her hands? The bright yellow figure shook slightly. The spear in Fan Ruo's hand was caught through the air by his uninjured hand. His fingers tightened slightly. The tyrannical Zhenshi in the emperor's body burst forth like a river or an ocean. After a light sound, the barrel of the spear was forcefully bent. The emperor's Zhenshi surged. His injuries worsened. He only narrowed his eyes and looked coldly at the scrap metal throne at his feet. It was as if he was interrogating the woman. He didn't say anything for a long time. How good would it be if Lao Wu never stepped into the world again? The emperor lowered his head and suddenly sighed gently. Slowly raising his head, he looked at Wu Zhu, who was sitting on the ground and leaning against Fan Xian's leg. With great difficulty, he shook his head. "I can't remember many things. However, what has happened. One day, he will remember what happened in the past and know something. He will come to kill me." The pale-faced emperor looked in a daze at Wu Zhu, who was dumb and speechless like a child. He tried to stand up, but could not. Suddenly, the emperor opened his mouth and said, "Lao Wu, you've forgotten some things again. Truly fortunate." When a powerful figure starts to become so naggy, does it mean that he is really old? Or was this the final radiance of a setting sun? Fan Xian looked in a daze at the one-armed emperor and suddenly felt an emptiness in his chest. He kept on feeling that everything that had happened today was too strange. It did not seem real at all. The light in the emperor's sunken eyes gradually dissipated. Looking at Fan Xian, he quietly said, "It wasn't you. In the end, it was only your mother who won." He gazed at Fan Xian mockingly without a trace of dejection. On the contrary, he was very much like that incomparably powerful ruler from a few years ago. Mockingly, he said, "The seat of the Zhang family's little emperor is yours. You know what kind of person the third prince is. No matter what you do in the future, this world will always belong to the Li family. You once said that after you died, even if the flood reached the heavens, I would have to think about it." The emperor looked at Fan Xian. The smile at the corners of his lips grew wider and filled with mockery. "Your mother is only trying to change the course of history, yet you vainly want to stop the course of history. What an arrogant and naive way of thinking." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly said, "Actually, you and I, in history, are both unremarkable splashes. No, the history books will have a page for me." A cold and proud light flashed through the emperor's eyes. Fan Xian didn't say anything more. Only now did he realize that he had still underestimated this emperor. Nothing he said or did could be hidden from him. He even knew about the red bean rice in northern Qi. The scene was a pool of blood. Fan Xian didn't move. He didn't dare move. His sister was under the emperor's control. He didn't even know how to resolve the situation before him. He also didn't know whether the emperor's current weakness was an illusion or if he had truly seen through certain things when he was about to die. Fan Xian had an innate respect for the emperor. Even at this moment, he still felt this way. He didn't know whether or not the imperial army outside the palace would break through the backup he had left behind and forcefully open the palace doors. He also didn't know how the Shadow and Yi Zhong were doing. He also didn't know why Eunuch Yao's group still hadn't appeared. What chilled him the most was whether the emperor's counterattack before his death would have Uncle Wu Zhu, his sister, and himself accompany him in death. Even now, he still believed that the emperor had this kind of power. The emperor raised his head with difficulty and narrowed his eyes slightly. Separated by the palace walls, he looked at the blue sky in the east. It was as if he had discovered that something beautiful was about to happen there. He gazed at the sky. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes trembled slightly. It was as if he had thought of something. His right hand, which was outside his long sleeves, curled slightly as if he wanted to hold onto something. The light in his eyes gradually gathered from the scattering. It was as if he wanted to see something clearly. Countless images flashed through his mind as if he wanted to remember something. No one knew the state of his body better than the Qing emperor himself. Perhaps from the beginning of the snowy days on the 8th of the new year, he had foreseen that this day would come. This was not a debt repayment. It was fate. However, why did he still have such a powerful dissatisfaction in his heart? His extremely furrowed brows were like a question, endlessly asking a question to the blue sky that had been washed by the rain and appeared exceptionally clean. When he was young, he silently endured humiliation in a ruined manner. When he was young, he traveled the world with his friends and increased his knowledge. When he was young, he galloped across the grasslands and the white mountains and black waters, leading countless men to conquer a large territory. He pointed his sword at the world and wanted to conquer an even larger country. His intention was to last for thousands of generations. He wanted to leave his name in the annals of history. However, all of this had to stop here. How could he be satisfied? He still had many things that he had yet to do. If the Qing emperor knew that these people, such as Yi Qingmei, Wu Zhu, and Fan Xian, were actually not people of this world, would he sigh with regret that the heavens wanted him dead and that it was not his fault for fighting? He was just thinking, if there was no that woman, there would not have been Lao Wu who had followed her into the world. There would not have been Ji. Perhaps there would not have been the palace treasury or many other things. Could he not have conquered this country himself? No, he could have done the same. At most, it would have been a little later. So what if he didn't have the nameless martial secret? Something like a great grandmaster who dared to oppose him should not have existed, should it not? However, if there was no if, If there was no Yi Qingmei, perhaps he would not have had those truly happy days in his life. The emperor's brows furrowed. He forgot about the life in his body and sank into this question. Fan Xian had once raised this question in the little building. It was not until now that the emperor truly asked him. Perhaps it was because he had never dared to ask himself this question in the decades that had passed. He withdrew his gaze and recovered his calm. The dying emperor still possessed an unparalleled might and will. He looked coldly at Fan Xian and Wu Zhu in front of him. It was as if he could use the last of his life to burn their lives away at any moment. There was a long silence. Fan Xian once again wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and watched each of the emperor's movements nervously. Even he did not realize that not only were his thin lips very similar to the emperor's, but his action of wiping away blood was also very similar to the emperor's. The emperor suddenly smiled. The corners of his lips curled up strangely. He then gradually restrained his smile. Coldly, he said, "Today I know what is in the chest. But there's one more thing I'm very curious about in my life." He narrowed his eyes and gazed at Wu Zhu. Enunciating each word, he said, "I very much want to know what exactly is hidden behind this black cloth." The last target of the most powerful emperor in the world had chosen Wu Zhu and not Fan Xian. Perhaps it was because Fan Xian was his flesh and blood. Perhaps it was because he thought that Wu Zhu, an emissary of the temple that he hated, truly deserved to die. Perhaps it was because the Qing emperor had always believed that the matters of the world should always be resolved by the people of the world and should not have those dogs *T gods interfere. Perhaps it was because the Qing emperor had discovered in that last moment that some of Fan Xian's indescribable actions were very similar to his own. In any case, his lightning-like hand split the air and attacked toward Wu Zhu's face while letting Fan Xian go. Fan Xian survived. In front of the emperor's last attack, his hand was shaken away like a leaf. It was completely unable to block it. He could only watch as the emperor's palm, mixed with the last bit of jinqi in his life, brushed viciously against Wu Zhu's face. With the emperor's brush, Wu Zhu's neck snapped abruptly, and he fell backward. The black cloth fell. Time seemed to freeze in this moment. The piece of black cloth slowly floated down in the cool wind. A piece of black cloth covered the glass windows of the Overwatch Council to hide the piercing light of the royal palace. A piece of black cloth covered Wu Zhu's eyes to hide the sky. This piece of black cloth had been covered for countless years. It seemed that there would never be a day when it would be undone. For hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, it had always been like this. Today, this piece of black cloth had fallen. Beneath the black cloth was a rainbow. A rainbow surged out from between Wu Zhu's delicate brows. It surged out from between his clear, lively, and perplexed eyes. In an instant, it lit up the square inside the royal palace and pierced through the bright yellow figure. The rainbow pierced through the Qing emperor's body and illuminated his incredulous expression. It then struck heavily against the palace of Taiji Palace and turned into a fire dragon, instantly igniting the entire palace. In just an instant, the emperor's expression suddenly became calm. Amidst this fire, he proudly straightened his body. Although he only had one arm, he straightened his body. In the instant before he left, a disdainful thought floated through his mind. So that was how it was. It was nothing more than this. It was still like this. Even in the instant of death, the most powerful person in the world would still leave behind an extremely powerful back. In this warm rainbow, this back appeared particularly cold and severe, silent, bleak, lonely, and unusually proud. The flying ash gradually fell. It was like the shrapnel of firecrackers used to offer sacrifices to the impermanence of the mortal world, spreading in the pool of blood in the square in front of the palace. At the same time, across the eastern sky of the palace walls, a rainbow finally appeared after the rain in the place where one always felt beautiful things would happen, overlooking the entire world. Night fell. The raging fire in Taiji Palace had already been put out. Fortunately, the rain had wet the ground. Otherwise, this fire would probably have burned the entire Qing royal palace into ruins. Not long after the strange rainbow appeared, the closed main gates of the royal palace were forcefully broken through by the court's army. No one could hide the news of the emperor's death. Even now, the mournful and incomparably angry people were still unable to find the emperor's remains. The person who assassinated the emperor was not a northern Qi assassin. It was the most heinous and unpardonable rebel in Qing history, Fan Xian. The court confirmed this news at the first moment. If it were not for the fact that the scholar and the heavily injured but not dead Yizhong had forcefully suppressed the grief and anger in Jingdo, perhaps in this night, many of the manors in Duke's Alley and Fan Manor would have been burned to the ground. The people inside would have no chance of survival, other than the scholar and Yizhong. The person who truly controlled the situation was the third prince, Li Qingping, who had ascended to the throne at the risk of the country. Under the powerful control of the Qing emperor, the situation in Jingdo did not go out of control. Of course, no one knew exactly what role the old Overwatch Council and other hidden powers had played. Unexpectedly, the criminal Fan Xian, who was once again wanted by the court and had a shocking reward, had appeared in a place no one would have expected. He was still in the royal palace. Under the cover of the night, he withdrew his gaze from Taiji Palace and walked in the little building that was even more deserted than the cold palace. Taiji Palace had already been burned, and the little building had long been reduced to ashes. He walked among the knee-deep grass with his head slightly lowered. No one knew why he had come. Or was he just here to tell Yi Qingmei everything that had happened today? Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly as he looked at the person who had appeared beside the ruins of the little building. He tilted his head slightly as if he had not expected it. The person who had appeared was Eunuch Yao. He expressionlessly walked in front of Fan Xian and handed over a small box. In a low, raspy voice, he said, "This is what the emperor left for you." Fan Xian accepted the box woodenly and watched Eunuch Yao disappear into the night. He was not worried that he would summon aces to surround and attack him. Outside the palace was one world, and inside the palace was another. In this world inside the palace, presumably no one would want to harm him. Even if someone wanted to, it would not be at this moment. What had the emperor left for him? Why did he leave it? Had he known beforehand that he would not be able to survive today's ordeal? Fan Xian stared in a daze at the box in his hand. Only now did he understand why Eunuch Yao had not been by the emperor's side earlier. The emperor had given him a strange mission. Opening the box, there was a piece of white silk and a thin letter. Fan Xian's body froze slightly. He immediately recognized what it was. This was one of the 3 things he had seen under the Empress Dowager's phoenix bed when he had entered the royal palace at night. He had long copied one of the keys and successfully opened the box. The white silk and this letter were the other 2. 4 years ago, when the eldest princess was rebelling in Jingdo, Fan Xian had once tried to find these 2 things again. In the end, he found that they were no longer in Hongguang Palace. Thinking about it now, the emperor must have placed them somewhere else. Later, the emperor knew that the key was in his hands, so he had only left this letter and this piece of white silk for him. Fan Xian used the tip of his finger to gently rub the surface of the white silk. Calming himself, he opened the unsealed letter and looked at it closely. Gradually, his brows furrowed and then relaxed. This was a letter Yi Qingmei had written to the Qing emperor. From the contents of the letter, he knew what the white silk was. This was the white silk the Empress Dowager had given to the witch Yi Qingmei to use to commit suicide. After Yi Qingmei received the edict in Taiping Courtyard, she had sent this white silk, untouched, back to the palace and delivered it to the Empress Dowager's bed. Presumably, only Uncle Wu Zhu could do such a thing. Presumably, the Empress Dowager had been terrified that day, so she had kept this white silk to deepen her hatred toward Yi Qingmei, that witch. Other than narrating this matter with a mischievous and smiling tone to express her strong displeasure, there was nothing else worth paying attention to in Yi Qingmei's letter. It was just family gossip, how Wu Zhu was, and how Fan Jian was in the brothel. Paired with the clumsy and stiff handwriting, it was truly unbearable to look at. Fortunately, There were only 2 thin pages. Fan Xian increasingly didn't understand why the emperor would treasure this letter so much to the extent that he would leave it for him. Was he wrong earlier? Regardless of whether it was the white silk, the key, or this letter, they were all hidden by the emperor in Hongguang Palace, and not by the Empress Dowager. He shook his head and stopped thinking about these questions that were destined to be buried in his memories and that no one knew the answer to. Immediately after, he noticed the handwriting on the back of the second piece of paper. The handwriting was strong and forceful, but it controlled emotion. It was written with particular order. It was clearly the emperor's handwriting. Fan Xian looked at it carefully. After looking at it for a long time, he sighed gently. His hands tightened. Unconsciously, he wanted to destroy the letter. Then, he carefully stuffed the paper back into the envelope and tucked it away in his clothes. I was not wrong. These were the last words the Qing emperor had left at the back of the letter. It appeared to be an unusually powerful and proud declaration. However, for it to be a declaration to a woman who had passed away, it could only be a faint self-questioning. No one could answer this question, other than history. No, even those history books that spoke with certainty would probably not be able to judge the merits and demerits of the emperor's life. It originated from Yi Qingmei and Chen Pingping. He only had hatred toward the emperor. However, his relationship with the emperor was not as simple as blood. The soul in his body could not acknowledge the blood connection, but he could not shake off the things that had happened over the years. This kind of emotion was extremely complicated. It cannot be expressed in words. The emperor had died. Even now, Fan Xian still felt numb and cold from his body to his heart. He didn't dare believe this reality. He had always felt that man was the most powerful person in the world and the most impossible to defeat. How could he have died? He seemed to be somewhat relieved, but he did not feel the joy of revenge. He seemed to be sorrowful, but he could not cry no matter what. He could only stand numbly in the cold wind. From the letter, one could see that there was no true path of the emperor in the world. The emperor's body had already failed this year. Even if it was as Yi Qingmei had said, letting each person become their own king was not the path of the emperor. Fan Xian and the beliefs he held on to were even less so. Just as he had said to his majesty on that snowy night, all he wanted was peace of mind and to settle a personal grudge. It did not involve the question of whether it was right or wrong. It should be known that humans were not a species that pursued the correct path. Being right was not justice because justice always had a stance. He suddenly thought of Yi Qingmei's memorials and letters that King Jing had treasured. He thought of how Yi Qingmei's letters to the emperor always talked about the world and the people's lives. There was only one letter with such a normal tone like today. Perhaps it was because of this that the emperor treasured it so much. Thinking of this, a bitter smile rose involuntarily to the corners of his lips. The emperor and Yi Qingmei were, without question, first-class romantic figures in the world. They were unspeakably beautiful. However, it was not a happy thing for the two of them to meet. For the emperor to meet a woman like Yi Qingmei was also a kind of pain. However, for Yi Qingmei to meet the Qing emperor was even more indescribably sorrowful. Fan Xian stood woodenly in the night palace among the long grass, looking at the remains of the little building in a daze. Even now, he still didn't know where Yi Qingmei was buried. Now that he knew what his father had said back then, it was only a kind of comfort. The yellow-clothed woman in the painting in the little building had already turned to dust and gone with the wind. The emperor had also turned to dust and gone with the wind. Perhaps, in some corner of the world, they would meet again. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.